Gandang umaga sa lahat. Panitikang hindi lamang nagtatala ng karanasan ng kanyang panahon, kundi mga piraso ng alaalang wawarak sa kumpiyansa ng mga buwayang luhaan. Ito ang araling lumilitaw-litaw sa mga nakaraang workshop session, maging sa mga extension lectures ng UP National Writers Workshop. Isang umagang nagwawarak, ngunit nagtatangkaring bumuo para sa lahat ng mga kapanalig. Ang ating morning session ay tatalakay sa mga posibilidad ng prosa sa magkaibang wika. Umpisahan natin sa proyektong Nobela ni Amado Anthony Arlo Mendoza III. Narito ang ating panelistang si Victor Emmanuel Carmelo Vim Nadera Jr. para himayin ang proyekto ni Arlo na pinamagatang Materyales sa Komplisidad.
Ligayang araw ni Manuel Luis Quezon. Dahil sa kanya, nagkaroon tayo noon ng linggo at ngayon ng buwan ng wika. Pasok na pasok ang araw na ito na inihahati niya sa ating manunulat ngayon sapagkat siya ay nagsusulat sa wikang pambansa at tamang-tama rin dahil ngayon ay buwan ng panitikan. No? Ang akin pong tinutukoy na kwentistang tatalakayan natin ngayong Agosto 19 ay walang iba kundi ang profesor mula sa Universidad ng Pilipinas, Diliman, Lungsod, Quezon. Siya po ay si Professor Amado Anthony III. Sino nga ba siya? Kilalanin natin ang Assistant Professor 3 ng Departamento ng Filipino at Panitikan ng Pilipinas. Nagtapos siya ng BA Creative Writing sa Pilipino sa nasabi ring pamantasan ng may magna cum laude lang naman. May Masters in Filipino siya sa Philippine Literature sa parehong institusyon noong 2020 niya tinapos. At nagkaroon siya ng Certificate in Bahasa Indonesia sa Universitas Anata Dharma sa Yogyakarta, Indonesia noong 2018. Nakapagsulat na siya ng maraming aklat. Katunayan, nakapagsalin siya ng mga koleksyon ng maikling kwento, nakapag-edit at nakapagsalin ng maikling kwento rin. Nakapag-edit at nakapagsalin din siya ng mga tula. At nitong huli, ang first script o antolohiya na maakda ni Tatay Ben o Bienvenido Lumbera. At siyempre, ang kanyang nobela, isa sa pinagkakaabalahan noon sa 2018 na inilathala ng Balanggiga Press, ang aklat ng mga naiwan. Meron din siyang maikling piyesa gaya ng tulang Toward General Theory of Matter Existing Between Death and Literature at tulang Aphorism. Gumawa rin siya ng mga pagpapakilala, no? Mga tula, maikling kwento sa iba't ibang mga kapwa niya, manunulat, partikular ang mga makata. Nandiyan din siyang sumulat ng mga salaysay, no, na lumabas sa kasong ito sa Tomas, ng Universidad ng Santo Tomas. Lumabas din ang kanyang mga kwento at tula, no, sa mga journal na kagaya ng Penzet. At nakapagsalin ng mga maikling kwento sa mga publikasyong gaya ng Pulirat. At ito yata sa tingin ko ang kanyang pinakapaboritong manunulat, no, si Eka kumyawan, no? Parang halos lahat yata na ng akda, no, ng nobelistang Indones na ito naisali na ng ating tampok na manunulat ngayon, no? At hindi lang siya may kakahon, no, sa pagsusulat na malikain, siya rin ay mananaliksik. At ilan lamang ito sa mga lumabas, no, lalo na sa likhaan journal natin. At ang mga artikulo na, kung titingnan nyo, panagkakita ang kabuhayan niya sa Encyclopedia of Philippine Arts ng Cultural Center of the Philippines. Isang buong pahina. At nakaranas na rin siyang masalang, no, sa palihan kagaya ng 22nd Iligan National Writers Workshop. Kaya hindi na bago sa kanya ang sumalang sa ilalim ng mga palihan. Nandun dyan ang mga papel na binasa niya at itinanghal, no? Partikular ang kanyang paksa, no, nakatuon kay Rizal Mojares, no, ang bago nating pambansang alagad ng sining para sa panitikan. Nandiyan din siyang umupo bilang panelist sa iba't ibang palihan, lalo-lalo na sa kauna-unahang Edel Garceliano Conference on Literary and Cultural Studies. At siya ay naging susing tagapagsalita, no, sa iba't iba pang mga kapulungan. At ito, naging interpreter at translator din siya, no, para kay Ekwa Kumyawan, no, nitong nakaraang Pen Congress sa Maynila na pinamagatang Speaking in Tongues. Mga kaibigan, pasalubungan po natin na masigabong palakpakan ang tinutukoy kong manunulat at profesor, si Ginoong Arlo Mendoza.
Magandang umaga sa lahat. Maraming salamat kay Sir Bim. Di ko alam kung meron pa akong dangal na may madadala pagkatapos nito. No? Gusto ko na lang maglungga sa kuweba pagkatapos ng pagpapakilala na yun. Pero maraming salamat. Yung pamagat ng aking presentasyon ay pamagat rin ng aking pinoproyektong nobela. Ang pamagat nito ay Materyales sa Komplisidad. So bago ang lahat, ako si Arlo Mendoza. Ako lang, tulad ng sinabi ni Sir Edward, gusto ko sana sabihin na ako lang to friend, kaya lang pagkatapos ng pagpapakilala ni Sir Bim, hindi ko na alam kung masasabi ko pa yun. So ito, no? Ito yung proyekto. Yung background ng aking presentasyon ay yung pabalat naman ng aking unang nobela na pinamagatang Aklat ng Mga Naiwan. Hinaharap ko sa inyo o pine-present ko sa inyo itong aking kasalukuyang proyekto kasabay ng naturang background dahil tulad ng nakasaad sa aking essay, no, yung poetics essay, ay bahagi ito ng isang binubuong trilohiya. Next slide po. So maikli lang po ang aking presentasyon, no. Nais ko lamang pong iharap, no, yung kasalukuyang proyekto, yung Materyales sa Komplisidad bilang bahagi, no, ng aking binubuong trilohiya, no. So hayaan niyo pong bigyan ko kayo ng maikling kasaysayan at paliwanag ng aking proyekto. So yung una pong nobela ng trilohiya, yung Aklat ng Mga Naiwan, na natapos kong isulat, no, noong 2014 bilang bahagi ng aking undergraduate thesis at nailathala naman noong 2018, no, sa Balanggiga Press nga, ay sa pinaka-esensya nito ay form-wise ay isang pagtatangka o isang pagsisikap sa part ko na parang paglaruan or at least pagbunggu-bungguin yung mga magkakaibang anyong nobelistiko, mga iba't ibang novelistic trends, no. So una yung novel of ideas o nobela ng mga ideya. Pangalawa, yung kathang detective or particularly detective novels, kasi isa sa mga malaking impluwensya ko nung mas bata ako ay yung mga akda ni Agatha Christie. So gustong-gusto ko siya bilang isang manunulat. Tapos nung undergrad rin ako, ang reading diet ko ay basically binubuo lang ng Latin American writers at saka ilang mga Southeast Asian writers. So obviously yung influence ng ng dictator novel o yung novela del dictador sa Latin America. May obvious nod rin yung, or at least may pagsisikap na magbigay ng nod itong unang novela dun sa mga nauna ring parang dictator novel sa Pilipinas. So siguro yung pinaka malinaw dito, I think on my part ay yung Twice Blessed ni Ninoshka Rosca, kasi tulad nung sinubok kong tangkain dun sa nobela ko, ang pangunahing tauhan o ang protagonista, quote-unquote, sa aking unang nobela ay yung diktador manunulat. No? Ang pangalan ay dun sa aking nobela ay Felix Canelo, katulad nung doon sa Twice Blessed na yung kambal, no? Na architects ng dictatorship ang parang mga protagonista ng nobela. So yun yung yun yung project dun sa unang nobela. Paano ka magsusulat ng isang nobela tungkol sa isang diktador na gusto rin maging manunulat, tapos sabay nandun rin yung pagtatangka na pagbabanggain o pagtagpuin yung mga binabanggit kong novelistic conventions. Yung pangalawang nobela naman ay yung Mavuvug, isang diksyonaryo. So technically ito yung sequel dun sa unang nobela, kasi basically sinusundan nito yung parang nakatuon ito dun sa mga events na nag-transpire sa buhay nung isa sa mga tauhan doon sa unang nobela years after the event, no? So siguro sa pinakamabilis na pagpapaliwanag, ang isa sa mga concerns ng nobelang ito, among many others, ay nga yung magnetite mining o pagmimina sa Cagayan Valley, kasi yung family ko galing, father side ko ay galing sa Cagayan Valley, so meron akong parang vague memories tungkol sa mga usaping yan, no? Lalo na nung madalas pa akong umuwi doon noong 1990s hanggang early 2000s. Tapos ito rin yung time na nung sinusulat ko tong nobelang ito ay nagsisimula na rin ako magkaroon ng interest sa wika, pag-aaral ng wika, ng dictionary, etc. etc. So for some reason, meron ring mga bahagi ng nobela na tungkol sa lexicography, at mula sa pamagat ng pangalawang nobela ay mababanaag nyo naman, no, yung ganoong klase ng aspekto. Tapos syempre yung pinaka core or sentro ng nobela ay yun nga yung parang pagtatangka kong i-fictionalize yung counterinsurgency campaigns, no, sa Cagayan Valley at sa buong Region 2. Sangayon sa ilang mga naibahagi sa akin ng magulang ko bilang mga dating bahagi ng Kilosang Pambansang Demokratiko. Tapos yun nga, 2015, tama kung di ako nagkakamali, kasi 2015 rin yung huling workshop na nasalihan ko at kung saan ako natanggap, no. Sa Iligan National Writers Workshop ay naisa lang ito. Very valuable yung mga comments na natanggap ko doon, kasi yun yung mga comments na nagamit ko para matapos yung nobela. Natapos ko na yung nobela, kaya lang di ko pa siya naipapasa sa kahit anong publisher. Ang meron lang ako ay yung ang published na bahagi lang ng nobelang ito ay lumabas nga doon sa Thomas Journal noong 2016. Pero sa pagkakalala ko, yung issue ay 2014 issue yata, pero 2016 lumabas. Anyway, so dito na tayo tutungo doon sa huling nobela. Itong huling nobela sa trilohiya, sa totoo lang, talagang medyo nahihirapan ako dito, kasi nung dinedesenyo ko o binubuo ko yung trilohiya sa aking utak ay yung mga bagay na naiisip ko sa pangatlong nobela ay inisip ko pwede ko siyang i-incorporate, no, doon sa naunang dalawang nobela, pero bilang mga afterthought or bilang mga appendice, no. Kaya sabi ko, why not challenge myself at gumawa ako ng isang nobela na parang medyo magkakaroon ng parasiti kong relasyon dun sa naunang dalawang nobela in that yun nga magiging siya parang katalogo o inventaryo ng mga materyales na related doon sa mundong nilikha ko doon sa naunang dalawang nobela. So ang naging resulta ay yung unang draft nitong third novel na nasaan yun ng maikling kwento, yung nabanggit ko sa aking essay, poetics essay na yung Labirinto ng mga Imposibleng Antolohiya, which is basically a short story that parang ask o nagtatanong kung ano pa kaya yung mga proyekto pagdating sa pag-aantolohiya na hindi pa naiisip at least sa kasaysayan ng politika ng Pilipinas. Tapos habang tumatagal, dahil nga medyo matagal bago ko ulit nabalikan itong pangatlong volume nung trilogy, naisip ko na baka kailangan ko rin mag-provide ng parang counting semblance ng narrative dito. Mga bagay na magpapaliwanag halimbawa sa backstory noong mga characters dun sa unang dalawang nobela. So, yun yung parang sinusubukan kong i-incorporate dito parang mas maging mas maging smooth yung reading experience kasi nauunawaan ko na hindi talaga parang yung unang iterasyon nitong proyektong ito, kahit naman yung una kong nobela ay medyo walang kompromisong binibigay para sa mga mambabasa pagdating sa usapin ng pagbabasa. So ayun, umaasa ako na yun nga tulad na nabanggit ko doon sa expectation checks noong unang bahagi ng programa ng ating workshop ay parang mabibigyan niyo ako ng input hinggil sa mga possibility at landas na pwedeng pahakin itong huling bahagi ng aking proyekto. So hanggang dito na lang po ang aking presentasyon. Maraming salamat.
Yan, narinig na natin ngayon kung sino si Arlo. No, meron na po ba tayong katanungan o reaksyon? Siguro habang naghihintay tayo, Sir Arlo, karaniwan hinahati ang politikang sa Pilipinas sa tatlo, no? Sabi nila, romantiko, realistiko, at radikal. Itong klasifikasyon ba ng nobela mo papasok doon soli o iba pa itong reaksyonaryo?
Usapin lang naman po ng tema yon. Hindi ko naman po siya parang kinukoin bilang isang lehitimong kategorya o etiketa. So ayun, parang kumbaga binuo ko siya, parang pinamagatan ko siyang ganun, sang-ayon dun sa parang nakikita kong tema na tumatakbo dun sa mga nobela.
Sa iba kasi parang pasibo ang reaksyonaryo. Anong tingin mo?
Siguro ginagamit ko yung reaksyonaryo sang-ayon dun sa nomenklaturang political sa pagitan halimbawa ng radikal at ng reaksyonaryo progresibo. So at least yun yung gamit ko. Pero naiintindihan ko na maaari siyang maunawaan na gano'n.
Okay, nakikita ko na yung unang pila. Pipay, pwede ka ba naming marinig? Magandang umaga.
Sige po, sir. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Arlo, bagos yung presentation mo. Alam pa rin ang bagos na? Since, oo. Since nakapunta ka din sa Indonesia. Arlo, may tanong lang ako sa proseso mo. Since, just so happens na I think na may pagkakapareho ng konti yung works natin, especially
medyo
in terms of...
nakita ko nga.
Especially in terms of yung paggamit ng bricolage, yung minsan nagdodraw ka from mga messages or yung mga speeches. Yung tanong ko ay, in terms of the style, may strategy ka ba sa pagpili ng mga vignette o form para magpakita ng progression? O paano mo pinipili yung kung ito yung form na gagamitin mo for this part of the novel, tapos ito naman yung susunod?
Sir Vin, pwede ko bang sagutin na ito ngayon?
Wala, sige, diretso na. Sorry.
Okay. At least dito sa sa Materyales sa Komplisidad. Ano siya parang I wrestled with the idea na gumamit talaga ng mga aktual na palitan sa pagitan ng mga grupo, mga grupong nagtutunggalian sa Spain during that time. Kaya kanya lang na-realize ko, ginawa na kasi yun Ginawa na yun ng mga Spanish writers na nagsusulat during the Franco era. So ako, ang ginawa ko na lang, parang nag-isip ako ng composite kumbaga parang tinignan ko yung esensya ng mga tunggaliang yun, ng mga gera patani na yun, ng mga debating yun. At gumawa ako ng composite, mga composite na excerpts, composite na mga vignettes, while retaining yung ilang mga historical kasi halimbawa marami sa mga binanggit kong mga publikasyon diyan ay nag-exist na Pravda ng CPSU, etc. Pero hinahaluan ko rin siya ng mga inimbento ko lang. Kunwari, inimbento ko lang naman yung Luz E Veritas. So parang malaking bahagi yung tulad nung nabanggit ng ating mga panelists, malaking bahagi yung mas malalim na pag-unawa sa material. Sa part ko, malaking bahagi na isa ito sa mga research interest ko. Kaya parang pag yung joke ko nga nung nag-uusap kami ni Sir Jun, pag tinatamad ako mag-research o may dead end ako sa research, magsusulat muna ako ng kwento o kung ano man kasi hindi ko na alam kung anong gagawin ko. Tapos madalas ang nagiging resulta yung frustrations ko or yung mga bagay na yung mga breakthrough na hindi ko mahanap sa research. Minsan ang nagiging resulta ay yung mga ganitong klase ng piyesa. Pero basically ganun, never ko kinonsider na halimbawa kumuha talaga ng mga aktual na CP. Kasi halimbawa ginawa na sa atin sa Philippines, ginawa na yun ni Edel Garceliano sa fiction niya, di ba? Yung ilang mga bagay niya bricolage talaga ng mga aktual na kunwari CP mula statement disart, ganyan, tas mga press statement na na-publish sa mga dyaryo sa Pilipinas. So nagawa na yun. So parang sa akin, ba't ko pa gagawin yun? Nagawa na. So inisip ko na lang, composite siya ng mga bagay. Yun lang yung proseso ko doon. Tapos syempre, yung typical na style na paano ko i-develop yung conflict sa pamamagitan ng ganong klase ng CP o vignettes. Yun.
Okay, salamat, Pipay. Okay ka na? Ang tingnan po natin ay si Papa Edward, Mama Luna, Papa Roland. Magkakapat sa unang workshop noong 1986.
Magandang umaga po. Congratulations, Sir Arvi. Hello, rinig ba ako yan? Una sa lahat, paano ko ba sasabihin? Pinasakit ng manunulat yung ulo ko sa unang pagbasa eh. Talagang pinag-isip ako, sabi ko, ano ba itong binabasa ko? Pero later, na-challenge akong magbasa at magbasa. Sa proseso ng ilang beses kong binasa, ang pakiramdam ko lang parang sunasanib sa kaluluwa. Yung kaluluwa ni Tet Maceda, sunasanib sa akin na parang, ano ito, sa ibaba? And then the later part, nung nag-round down na ng mga pangyayari on the last day, on the last 30 minutes, naalala ko naman yung sinulat ni Gelasio Guillermo na may kinalaman sa diary ng hukbo na pinablish ng anong tawag dito ng CCP. So sa pakiramdam ko tama, mukhang kailangan lang ng ilang backstory para masundan ko ito pag sinimulan ko yung pagbabasa. Kasi alam ko yung ibang personaheng ginagamit, pero siyempre dahil sa nabasa ko, kadalasan ang kasaysayan kasi sinusulat ng mga nagwagi at yung nasa kapangyarihan. Ito, tinitignan niya yung kasaysayan sa punto de vista ng karaniwang mamamayan. Kaya tama ka nga kung magsalita siguro si Arnolfo ba yun? Canelo. Ang sasabihin niya rin, ako lang to friend. sa mata ng isang karaniwang tao, paano niya tinitignan yung komplikasyon at tunggalian nitong nangyaring panahon. Kasi mukhang kung di ako nagkakamali, it took me ilang pagkakataon para masilip ko na ang event ay nangyayari sa isang kilusan noong 1937. And that time, looking at the Philippines, hindi mo maiwasan na nakakapag-link nato sa Russia. Kasi binanggit mo si Evangelista, nakaupo naman to sa last Commune International bago niya itayo yung kauna-unang party sa Pilipinas. Pero on the process, makikita mo rin yung nangyayari kay Franco, tapos yung opinion ng mga taong nandun sa loob ng kilusan, kung paano sa simpleng pananaw ay yung magkaibang pananaw sa Trotsky at yung sa Marxista. Kasi sa mababasa mong libro, simpleng sasabihin sa iyo o mas komplikadong sasabihin sa iyo na tunggalian ng mga Menshevik at Bolshevik. Pero ito sa mata ng karaniwang nakasama sa kasaysayan at naging saksi, yung tinig nila mula sa ibaba, nakikita mo. Hanggang sa huling sandali na naging karanasan niya kung paano siya mamatay. So susundan mo yung story. Hindi ako makapag-comment sa kabuuan ng struktura niya. Ang kaya ko lamang sabihin, kung susubaybayan ko to, it gives you a picture ng isang bahagi ng kasaysayan na kadalasan ay hindi naririnig. Ang kadalasang kasaysayan natin, yung mga nakasulat na, yung nagawa ng mga may kapangyarihan. Pero ito sa punto de vista ng mismong kalahok, sa punto de vista ng mga karaniwang tao na nasa ibaba, sinasabi niya what was happening that time, which led dun sa ganung pangyayari. So na-appreciate ko yung history with the manner you wrote the kwento, the novela. But on the other hand, na-appreciate ko rin kasi yung pagiging panitikan niya. Kasi habang kino-consider mo yung kasaysayan, saka mo nare-realize, nga pala, itong mga manifestong ito, itong mga parang diary of events that happen, is an avenue para maintindihan mo. Pag yung inayos, maintindihan mo rin, other than maunawaan mong kasaysayan, malalaman mo na itong maganitong forma ay isang anyo ng panitikan na dapat ma-appreciate at higit na magpapalalim ng pagkaunawa ng pagka-Pilipino o pagkatao ng Pilipino at nagiging buo yung kasaysayan. So, para sa akin, natuwa ako doon sa binasa ko. In fact, ito yung example ng lalo mong pagtitibayin na kailangan talaga ng kursong panitikan at kursong may kinalaman sa wika. Kasi hindi buo yung kasaysayan, pero once nabasa mo to, it gives you a picture na maaring sa isang banda nakokompleto yung pagtingin mo sa kasaysayan mula sa punto de vista ng isang pangkaraniwan tao. Kaya yun lang at maraming salamat. Natuwa ako at the end, I enjoy reading the material kahit na hindi pa kompleto. Congratulations po.
Papa Edward, talaga mahilig kang manilip, ano? Mama Luna, game ka na ba?
Mahalaga ang ambisyon para sa pagsulat ng isang akda at yun naman ang klarong-klaro dun sa teksto na ipinasa ni Amado. Amado ang tawag ko pa kay Arlo kasi nung naging estudyante ko siya, tuwang-tuwa ako na may kapangalan ng ang aking anak at hindi ko siya matawag na Arlo. Anyway, sa pagbasa ko ng iyong akda, gusto kong pasiglahin pa ang ganitong mga proyekto na nobela ng mga ideya. Dahil kulang na kulang ang sa mga nababasa ko sa mga nobela, lalo na sa Filipino, kulang ang ganitong mga akda. Pagkaraan na malimbag ang sinulat ni Ramon Guillermo na ang Makina ni Mang Turing, tuwang-tuwa ako na lumitaw yun Kasi kailangan na pinapasigla rin ang mga nobela ng ideya. So, total nandun na ako sa puntong yun. Pinaka natuwa ako na bahagi dun sa akda mo, yung nasa isang sulat na address kay Anasieto na mula kay Andres Soriano. Tingin ko, kung wala ang liham na yon dun sa excerpt na ipinabasa mo sa amin, mahihirapan akong kapitan kung ano ang pinoproyekto mo. Ang ibig kong sabihin ay ang liham ang nagbigay ng narrative arc dun sa compendium ng mga iba't ibang mga sulatin. Siguro dahil sanay ang aking reader eye sa pagbabasa ng mga sulat. But then again, ang ginagawa mo dun sa sulat ay parang may time lapse ang sulat na ito. At quite clever ang paggamit ng time lapse kasi pinapakita mo yung proseso. Well, syempre, kung paano tinorture si Canelo, tama ba ang aking natatandaan dun sa narrative? Takot ako kasi baka, alam mo na, sakit lagi ng ulo ko baka naging magulo yung pagkakonect ko dun sa mga tauhan. Anyway, yung slow cooking of the execution truly helped in my understanding of what you're trying to do, because there's a parallel movement of that slow cook with the realization of the reader that yung slow death na yon ay parang unti-unti ring lunuluto yung awareness o yung insight na walang tunay na kakampi. Parang yun ang lumilitaw na ideya, walang tunay na kakampi at masaklap ang ginawa kay kay Canelo dahil kahit reaksyonaryo siya at pumapanig sa dalawang mga kampo, nakapag-invest ako ng kaunting simpatya sa kanya. Tao pa rin siya. At hindi naman din niya ginagawa ang paglipat-lipat ng mga kampo dahil wala siyang pinaniniwalaan. Meron siyang sarili niyang siguro ideya ng revolusyon o siguro ideya ng pagpapalaya na hindi kailangan parang yung reader ang tutunton at hindi pinabubulwak dun sa letter. Sa lahat ng bahagi ng sulat, habang umiigting, di ba, yung margin of time at palapit ng palapit yung kanyang execution. Halimbawa, sa number 25 ng liham na ito, nagiging lyrical ang moment of death. Kapag binasa natin, ito yung tuwang-tuwa ako na bahagi ng iyong sinulat. 3 segundo bago siya paslangin, naalala niya, tulad ng sino mang tanto tanggap na ang kanyang napipintong kamatayan, ang mga pinakawalang kapararakang bagay sa mundo. Ang liwanag na pumipigla sa pagitan ng mga daliri ng musmos na nanghuhuli ng alitaptap, ang mga butil ng kanin sa ilalim ng mesa na pinagpepiyestahan ng mga langgam, ang amoy ng dugong humahalo sa mga sapa at ilog, ang paninindigan ng mga unionista, ang uha ng isang sanggol, mga aninong naglalaho sa gabi, mga salitang hindi na nakawala sa dulo ng bida, at pahina ng mga aklat na hindi pa naisusulat, na hindi pa naiisip isulat, at o hindi na maisusulat kailanman. Tuwang-tuwa ako dun sa bahaging yun at happy na lumitaw ang parang akala mo na naligaw na lyricism dun sa pag-identify ng kung ano ang nangyayari dun sa slow cooking na yun. It's as if dun sa puntong nawalan siya ng buhay, naging tao, lubos na tao siya, na malay sa kanyang pag-iral bilang tao. At ang ganda-ganda ng insight na yon. At yaman din lang na sinabi mo na influensyado ka ng mga dictator novels ng Latin America. Of course, nakikita ko ang bakas ng Chronicle of a Death Foretold ni Garcia Marquez. Sinasuggest ko na maging mas playful pa ang teksto na ito, na parang hindi ko alam kung type mo yung comparison, pero I cannot help but remember the way Crepusson did Great Energy Jungle Cafe, na kung saan pumipigla siya dun sa realism at nandun ka na pumipiglas ka sa realismo, pinagsama-sama niya ang mga tauhan na hindi nanggagaling sa parehas na timeline. At nagsasalo-salo sila at nag-aasaran, nagtutudyuhan sa isang energy jungle cafe. So I suggest you do some of that kasi given your talent, you are very capable of doing such convergences among your characters and your ideas. Muli, binabati kita, Amado, dun sa sinulat mo.
Papa Roland, salamat Mama Luna.
Kung in the past workshop ay niloload natin yung mga akda, yung mga proyekto na very accessible at marami siyang appeal. Yung ganitong klaseng accessibility dahil it provides us ample feedbacking din, ample insights to draw from dun sa mga proposed projects. No? Ako naman, na-appreciate yung denseness nitong nobela, yung layers at yung complexity niya. Dahil may integrity yung nobela. As a novel of ideas, may proposition siya. Kaya lang nakakahinaya nga na yung unang bahagi o yung unang section pa lang, chapter, ang natunghayan natin. Kaya hindi pa lubos na ma-pin down kung ano yung gusto niyang sabihin at saan ito ano yung tatahakin niya sa buong kabuuan ng nobela. Palagay ko, dun sa trilogy na pinopose mo, at mahirap pag-propose ng ganitong klaseng seriality sa novel. No? Kahit naman sina Promedya Tour ay yung kanyang trilogy tungkol sa Earth of Mankind, parang wala namang ugnayan din sa isa't isa other than the idea of colonialism and the struggle for relief dito sa social issues na ito. Or yung Rosales novels naman ni, what is his name, basta yung isang national artist, ay wala namang kinalaman sa isa't isa maliban sa nakaangkla sa pinanggalingan niya Rosales o pinagsimulan ng mga nobela sa Rosales. So dapat wala din pressure, I think, na masyadong i-tighten yung ugnayan ng tatlong nobela. Hindi man ito katulad ng Noli at Fili na may flow sa susunod na bahagi yung character at yung project of transformation of the place, yung San Diego. No? Nagustuhan ko dahil parang na-widen ito yung idea natin ng nobela. Na manipis na nga pero parang parang napaka-limited din mga paksa or yung estilo ng pagsulat ng nobela. So na-enrich nito yung mga garden variety of the novel, of the Filipino novel. No? So maganda yun. Pero ang parang hinihiling ko pa rin sana na pag-isipan pa rin ng nobelista yung accessibility issue. At hindi naman kailangan ay mabasa ito ng lahat in terms of one. Pero in terms of the impact na gusto mong gawin sa idea mo. Ibig sabihin, ang Noli at Fili gets natin, even lalo na nung matapos itong i-require sa atin nung high school, na-gets natin lalo yung richness of the project at yung relevance of the project. Kasi kahit na nasulat siya about the Spanish colonial period yung tinatalakay niya, ay napaka-rich ng sinasabi nito about characters that still remain in place in the country right now. So baka naman gusto mo magbigay din ng opening at yung binabanggit ni Luna na mga ganong klaseng suggestion, plus yung nabanggit ko na rin na lagyan mo din ng babad moments. Yung sulat na yun sa akin ang pinaka-impactful in terms of writing. Kasi ay napaka-postmodern na may listahan ka ng mga sandali. Lalo na yung detalye tungkol sa ilang oras bago pagpaslang, isang segundo bago pagpaslang. Maganda yung mga detalye na yun at na-engage lalo. Yung audience parang nagbubukas, may attempt man lang yung nobelista nga na buksan yung kanyang nobela towards other kinds of readers na gusto lang talaga magbasa. At dahil nobela ito, pag tinapos niyang basahin yung nobela, ay may takeaway siya na insight na isipin niya relevant sa kanya. Pero kapag sinasarado natin kagad dahil napaka-dense na dami-dami presupposition about history and the formation of the idea itself, baka ma-lose natin siya sa process of the reading. No? Yung binabanggit na bricolage, maganda yun dahil nakikita nga natin yung bits and pieces. Pero ang challenge always sa bricolage ay yung kabuuan. Makikita ba natin yung big picture, yung grand schema of the project? At yun yung challenge dito na yung pagka-layer, yung tapestry na mabubuo dito sa pamamagitan ng pagpasok ng maraming tinig, maraming teksto, ay in the end, dapat mabuo siya into a coherent picture. At yun yung challenge parati sa ganitong klaseng proyekto. No? Lalo na at kung ito pa nga ay bricolage, ay may idea din na sinasambit dito sa proyekto na to. So ako gusto kong batiin at sana nga ay marami pa ang makabasa nito ng napakahalagang proyekto mo, Arlo.
Salamat, Papa Roland. Amang, CR.
Oo, Arlo, ang hirap basahin ito kasi yung iniharap mo ay outline lang ng mga mangyayari na kung ano yung nasa isip mo, ewan. Tapos mahirap pa yung main concept. Ang pagbabasehan ko una rito, palagay ko kaya mo kasi yung mga nawawala mo, kakaiba yun eh. Yung unang nobela mo, na yung mahirap din intindihin. Pero dahil mahusay yung dialogue, yung heteroglossia, yung ang dami-daming boses, ang dami-daming nagsasalita na iba-iba yung ideya. Kaya nga tinatanong ko sa iyo kung yung Gamboa ba yung influence. Na dito tingin ko yung ganung estilo mo, magagawa mo naman eh. Yung ito naman, mga sulat-sulat lang. Pero pagka sa dulo, pag pinagdugtong-dugtong, isa naman, mabubuo naman yung kwento. Ang pinuproblema ko, siyempre nabasa ko rin yung labirinto mo na lahat yata na isulat mo, mahirap basahin. Pero kamukha ni Luna, itong trabaho mo, tsaka itong kay Bongin, pagka gusto kong ipakita kung ano yung push na yung pupuntahan ng nobelang Pilipino, kayo nila Idel ang yung nandiyan sa ganyang kategorya. Ang isang problema ko dito yung data eh. Mas marami kang alam sa Spain kaysa sa Pilipinas, yung setting ni Canelo pagka yung nasa Pilipinas siya. So pinoproblema ko yun. Kasi iba yung idea mo ng Spanish left ay iba sa Philippine left. Yung left ng Spain and the rest of the world ay meron silang left of center, left of left, right of center, right of left. Yung mga ganon na yung dito nung hinahanap ko yon, napunta ka doon sa yung kay Trotsky, yung anarchy. So dahil mahilig ako sa history, abangan ko yon. Na yung may dala nung anarchism dito si Isabelo de los Reyes eh. Natingin ko, magiging crucial yon. Wala pa yung mga Marx noon. Yun lang nung nakulong si de los Reyes. Yun lang yung dala niyang sa Montjuic Castle. Yung iniisip ko yung isang eksena eh, para mabuo yung karakter mo. Para rin yung setting, yung maintindihan ko. Ano kaya kung ando doon yung mahina ng De Los Reyes, tapos yung radical left on the eve of war, dumating na sa Pilipinas, yung nilalaslas nila yung mga librong Marxist, yung sa eskolta, yung bookstore, mahilig ka naman sa bookstore yung Blade para magkaroon sila ng kopya na minimemorize ni Evangelista. Ano kaya yung isang setting na nandoon si Abad Santos, si De Los Reyes, si Evangelista? Anong mangyayari sa diskusyon nila? Tapos yung ina-approximate ko yung closest doon sa Trotsky na hindi naman Trotsky. Kung nandoon din, binanggit mo naman si Ramos, nandoon din eh. ilagay mo si Ramos doon, ilagay mo si Jacinto Manahan, yan naman yung mga nagbenta roon sa revolusyon. And then makikita mo kung bakit yung usapin ng Old P at saka yung UP, crucial. Yung maraming ganyang usapin Tapos siguro, yung gusto kong, just in case, baka hindi mo pa natatap, ang maraming data dyan, yung kay Franco, yung GAN, si Abet Umali, siya yung nangungulekta ng mga sulat diyan, yung mga dyaryo diyan, pati yung mga tulang Kastila nila Baldemor, yung lahat ng kasi
Balmori yata, Balmori.
Balmori, sorry, tama ka, si Jesus. Kasi mahilig ka mag-footnote. Tapos yung iba naman doon, totoo, yung iba hindi. Di guluhin mo na yung pwede naman, no? Sa dulo, ano pa idadag ko? Hanggang siguro yung kay Pomeroy, pwede ka umabot doon kung kakailanganin Basta ang hindi ka kakapusin ng maraming totoong writers na progressive. In fact, ang mga writers sa Pilipinas, mula panahon nung mga nila Rizal hanggang kila Amado Hernandez, mukhang magkamag-anak yung pagsusulat at saka yung pagpo-protest. Siguro yun yung recap. Siguro yung hinahanap ko. Gusto ko maramdaman yung setting. Kasi na-alienate ako pagka yung nagdi-discuss ng Spain, Filipino reader ako. Tapos alam ko yung writer ay Filipino rin. So hindi ko mapigil na yung gusto ko maramdaman na ang nagsulat nito Pilipino. Kasi yung pag ina-appropriate mo yung Spain, alam ko appropriation lang yun Pero yung kulay, yung terrain mismo, yung lagi kong sinasabi sa mga estudyante ko, yung setting hindi lugar Yung setting ay laging cultural, laging historical. Tapos yung dialogue ay hindi siya boses ng karakter. Yung dialogue ay laging ito yung ideological position nung nagsasalita. So kaya nga sa dulo nung lahat ng kwento pinapatay natin yung kontrabida Yun lang bida na nagbubuhoses ng pinaniniwalaan natin. Yun lang yung binubuhay dito. At yun ay gusto ko kasi magiging gray area Anong gagawin ko sa isang Trotskyite? Anong gagawin ko sa isang anarchist na yung RJ at saka kuwan yung mga problema sa Pilipinas? No? I'm sure maraming variation yan. But nonetheless, yung pag-elevate mo nung crime story, maganda yun Kasi yung whodunit saka yung detective story na sinauna, predictable na yun pero itong crime story mo may kahalong soul searching at saka madaming yung nangungonsyensya ini-involve mo pati yung reader kung yung gano'n na dapat kung sino yung hindi suspect, yun yung criminal. But anyhow, dahil nga swerte siguro na na-aksidentehan ko masubaybayan yung mga trabaho mo. Arlo, congratulations. Tingin ko magiging malaking contribution ito doon sa yung pag-i-evolve ng yung patutunguhan ng fiction sa Pilipino at dito sa Nobela. Yung pagtataas noong yung mga political novel o yung tinatawag nating novel of ideas. So, yun lang muna.
Salamat, Amang. Speaking of setting in Spain, Miss Marian.
Good morning po. Good morning sa lahat. Good morning, Arlo. Gusto kitang i-congratulate kasi hindi madali itong ginawa mo. Gumamit ka ng, sabi nga ni Amang June, yung iba, totoo, yung iba, create mo lang. Tapos, you put them together kasi meron kang kine-create na narrative. Tapos, at the end of the excerpt, na siguro medyo masyado lang siguro talaga akong nerdy. Nag-enjoy ako sa pagbabasa nitong mga excerpt na yung parang yung bricolage nga na gano'n, tapos historical pa. Tapos at the end of the excerpt, clear naman sa akin na yung work na ito, para siyang gusto mo siyang maging reflection on how the written work, especially yung mga little known at unofficial, hindi yung state records ha, pero yung mga written work na unofficial can be crucial supporting documents to a revolution. Nakita ko din sa poetics mo na sinasabi mo yung literature, it will not solve our problems for us, but it can be a tool for support. Parang consistent ka doon sa poetics mo tapos dito sa excerpt na pinisent mo to the workshop. Kaya nga, nalulungkot ako na hindi ko malang nabasa yung first 2 books nitong trilogy na ito. Kasi siguro itong tanong ko masasagot na doon. Yung setting kasi nitong excerpt na nabasa ko, para siyang yung nag-gather nitong mga sulatin na ito lives in the present time. Kasi meron na nga siyang nag-gather na minimension na si Duterte. So, present time na siya. Pero parang it's an alternate Philippines wherein the fascist state has already succeeded kasi meron ng Bureau on Anti-Insurgency and Anti-Revolution. Parang mas masyado nang naging in your face yung pagiging pasista ng state. So is it a reimagining of an alternate situation of the Philippines? Kung ganun, it would be interesting to know kung i-explore ba ng nobela na ito how we got there, and will the novel even discuss that, or baka na-discuss na kasi yun doon sa first 2 novels. I wouldn't know, kaya nga medyo careful din ako sa pagtanong nito kasi baka naman I'm asking a question na answered na noon pa. So yun lang yung tanong ko kasi when we are imagining an alternate reality, parang it should always be, actually hindi pa ako decided, pero meron kasing element na pwede siyang maging cautionary tale na if we don't do this, magiging ganun tayo. Parang may element na ganun. And since yung poetics mo naman, aminado ka na you're highly political, ito ba yung binabalak mo sa nobelang ito? And was this already addressed in the previous novels? At yun namang yung ibang comment ko dito about technique, nasagot na ng iba, but I would just like to commend you. Hindi madali itong ginawa mo, pero I think nag-succeed ka pa rin. Kasi yung pagsusulat mo ng iba-ibang voice when creating the bricolage, hindi madali mag-shift ng writing technique. Hindi siya madali. So kung paiba-iba ka, I'm wondering, paano mo siya nasusustain? Kasi yung isang voice nga lang ng isang nobela, ang hirap-hirap i-sustain. Pero ikaw, bricolage, pero parang hindi naman nag-dissipate yung power ng technique dito sa excerpt na ito. So, yun lang po ang aking masasabi. Salamat, Arlo, and congrats.
Miss Marian, gusto bang dagdag yung penguin?
Ayo po, yung penguin nga pala is accepting novels. So, just go to penguin.sg. Tapos merong menu sa upper left corner. Click nyo lang yon, may drop-down menu. Piliin nyo lang yung publish with us. Nandun yung submission guidelines nila. Hindi nila nga kailangan yung full draft. I-describe mo lang muna yung project mo. And then siguro, I think yun yung time na magde-decide sila, na magre-reply sila sa inyo, and then they will say, okay, give us the manuscript, we'll see if we can publish it. So, penguin.sg, and then click nyo na lang yung menu at the upper left corner. Yeah. Salamat po, Arlo and Sir Vin.
Sasagutin mo na ba, Sir Arlo?
Mabilis lang kasi magsasalita pa si Sir Butch.
Oo.
Yung siguro yung dun sa tanong na masasagot ba yung tanong, siguro partly, no? Although yun nga, tulad na nabanggit ko kanina, parang ang una kong intention para sa ikatlong nobela ay parang add-in, parang supplementary text para dun sa naunang dalawang nobela. So siguro partly, no, kasi yung unang nobela ay tungkol dun sa rehimen nung diktador, which is yung progeny ni Arnulfo. So parang medyo mauunawaan nung mambabasa yung ano ba, parang sinasabi mo kaninang alternate reality kung nabasa yung unang nobela. Pero ayoko kasing gamitin yun na dahilan. Kaya parang at the end of the day, gusto ko pa rin tumayo ng mag-isa itong ikatlong nobela. Parang ganun. Parang kanina binabanggit ni ni Sir Roland na parang at the end of the day, yung mga general themes na lang yung magtatahi dito sa nobelang ito. At parang sana maintindihan siya bilang ganun. Parang ganun. Kasi parang ayoko namang ilagay yung burden na sa mga mababasa na basahin lahat ng tatlong nobela. Sakit na nga sa ulo niyan. Papasakitin pa yung ulo sa ibang mga nobela. So, ayun, parang pangkalso nyo na lang sa mesa pag medyo maugat. Parang gano'n.
Okay,
Anyway,
Boss
ayun.
Boss. At saka si Boss Bomen.
Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat at lalo na kay Arlo. I still have to wrap my head around the whole project, but I can see its outlines and intentions. Napansin ko nga na ngayon yata yung araw na nakadevote sa literatura ng politika. I mean, everybody's work here is political, of course, but in a more, I think, more tangible sense. Itong tatlong mga piyesa natin ngayong araw ay nakatutok lahat sa mga usaping politika or political. And which is probably a good thing because it focuses us on a very important aspect of literature. Again, I can't speak to the details of Arlo's work, although I like its ambition and its willingness to go outside the usual tropes of Philippine, the Philippine political situation, and steps outside, goes back to Francoist Spain to presumably to talk about things that also would happen here. As June was pointing out, the argument between Trotsky and Stalin carries over to the RA-RJ division here, and I like that that strategy of Arlo's. Kahit na Espanya ang setting ng mga ilang eksena, I think sometimes tayo mga Pinay kasi na manunulat, masyadong kino-confine natin ang ating sarili dito sa ating mundo dito sa Pilipinas, where foreign authors, for example, especially white authors, will write about everyone on the planet. Pero tayo, we hesitate to do the reverse. But with enough knowledge and ambition, we can also do that, and we should. There's no reason why we can't write about China, about Germany, or of course the United States. We've done that for a long time. I'm particularly fascinated by the references to Andres Soriano here, because coincidentally, as I was saying yesterday, I'm also working on a novel about Manila in the 1930s, and of course, one important aspect of that is the Phalangist movement here, na pinangunahan ni mga katulad ni Soriano, yung ating mga Kastilaloy dito, And it's also interesting that when you look at the history of the Phalange here, the Phalange was the fascist party that was being run from Spain, but it had its local representation here. And of course, all of the leading Spanish or Spanish-Filipino capitalists joined that. But it's interesting when you look at the history of that movement here, na kahit sila mismo dito may awayan. Dahil nga masyadong for some of them didn't take it quite as seriously as the others. Yung mga galing sa Espanya na pinapunta dito, talagang bumaba daw dito sa Pilipinas, naka-fascist uniform pa at nag-fascist salute. The others were getting on board just for the sake of a supposed political expediency. And in fact, in other words, istorya ito na pagbabalimbing din ng prinsipalya natin. At least yung Kastilang elemento niyan. Because while they were Phalangists, they were also friends of Quezon. And as soon as the war started, some of them took on Philippine citizenship to avoid being interned as the enemy. So in other words, may masalimuot na kasaysayan dito na may koneksyon sa Pilipinas na masarap halukayin. And my novel partly addresses that. Again, as I will say with the two other works today, I am very, very interested in the idea of complicity in dictatorship. How we, from the upper class to the lower class, buy into this idea when it suits our motives. And so I sana in the future ganitong trabaho ni Arlo ma-translate din sa English para mas marami ring tao sa labas ang maka-benefit dito. Maraming salamat.
Salamat, Boss Butch, Boss Bomen.
Pagbati kay Arlo sa kanyang obra, tama nga yung nasabi ng iba na yun nga, ang pinakaunang mapapansin dito ay yung kanyang ambisyon. Pati doon sa kanyang nobela na lahat ng mga naiwan ay may pagkakahawig. Siguro kasama ko si Jun dito na nakabasa ng nobelang ito na parang pareho yung challenges para sa mambabasa na inihaharap, kahawig nito. Bagamat yung naalala ko roon ay yung parang fictional talaga, yung Situationist International ay parang merong branch o chapter sa Pilipinas, at parang medyo may parody quality, may I think nandoon nanggagaling yung humor noong isa sa mga bahagi ng trilohiya na ito. Ngayon, sa pagkakabasa nitong mga maikling mga bahagi ng kanyang bagong proyekto, ay gusto ko lang siguro yun nga, siguro tingnan yung kasaysayan muli, at siguro isang basis ng character na parang double agent, espiya, yung pangunahing character ay isang very famous German, si Richard Zorge, na naging Soviet spy siya na naka-infiltrate ng Nazi party, tapos nag-ooperate sa Japan, very complex yung naging kasaysayan ni Richard Zorge, na ayun, so basically sa Japan siya actually natuklasan na espiya siya, pinatay si Zorge doon, but he had a long history as a spy, also one of the most effective ones, na nakatulong din sa Allied victory, laban sa mga fascists, Ngayon, yung dito lumilitaw yung sapin ng na yung nobela nga ni mga nobela ni Arlo ay may katangiang cosmopolitan yung kanyang diwa, Ibig sabihin, tumatawid-tawid talaga sa mga pambansang hangganan, Cosmopolitan, internationalist, So ang kanyang mga nababanggit ng mga kilusan ay umaapaw sa mga pambansang hangganan katulad ng mga Trotskista, mga komunista, mga falangista, Lahat yan ay nagkaroon ng katangiang internasyonal, At maganda yung mga nasulat nga ni Florentino Rodao, I think baka ginamit na ni Arlo itong mga sources, tungkol sa mga Pilipinong falangista na tumulong o kaya nagpunta pa nga sa Espanya para maging mga tumulong doon sa tagumpay ni Franco doon. Gayon din kasabay nito 1936 to 1939 yung mga komunista rin sa Pilipinas ay nagpadala ng mga contingent ng mga Pilipino sa Espanya, so nakita-kita ang mga tao ron sa Espanya doon sa makasaysayan na Spanish Civil War. Kumbaga it was like the Second World War in advance, yun nangyari sa Spain na yon. At gayon pa man ang siguro ang nami-miss ko doon kay Arlo ay parang masyadong individual yung trato doon sa katangian ni Canelo, Kumbaga ay parang wala siyang context na kung paano yung kanyang paglalakbay at kung paano yung mga kasama niya mga Pilipino, mga galing sa Pilipinas na napadpad sa Espanya, Kaya nga yung concern ni June, bakit parang Espanyang exclusive Spain ito? It could almost be Spaniard. Kasi kung tingnan niyo yung biografiya ng mga Pilipino naman nagpunta sa Espanya nung panahon na yon para lumuhok doon sa tunggalian na yon sa magkabilang panig, makita niyo na iba't iba at masalimuot yung kanilang mga kasaysayan bilang mga individual. May mga purong Espanyol, may mga kalahating Espanyol, may mga purong Pilipino na nagpunta roon, maraming naging bahagi ng Spanish Communist Party, ng mga Pilipino na nagpunta rin doon. Kaya meron silang komplikadong mga personal at individual na kasaysayan. May mismong pagtawid mula sa Pilipinas patungo sa Espanya bilang isang grupo o grupo na hiwa-hiwalay din, watak-watak, pero pag nagtagpo na roon ay nakikita-kita, nagkasama-sama, mayroon silang parang maliit na mga komunidad sa hanay ng mga international brigade. So, yun siguro ang isa kong masyadong individualized yung treatment kay Canelo. Parang wala siyang environment na mga kasama, mga kaibigan. Well, siguro that's why he can deceive so many people because he doesn't seem to have any personal connections, Pero parang yung thickness of history na may kinalaman doon, parang nawawala, Mismo in fact, kung tingnan niyo yung mga kasaysayan nito, may mga photographs, maganda sana kung magamit ni Arlo itong mga photographs ng mga falanghista sa Pilipinas, mga photographs ng mga komunista, na nagpunta roon para ipagtanggol ang mga republikano, So mga interesting na marami pang mga scraps from this scrapbook of history na magagamit para dito sa proyekto ni Arlo, Ngayon, yung isa ko na lang na comment ay year 2077 yata yung pagkalathala ni Garcia dito, at yung mga iba pang text ay galing 2077. Ang feeling ko ay by 2077, which is 56 years from now, marami na mga political changes ang nangyari, So tataka ko bakit Jose Maria Sison pa rin nandoon, bakit mga parang yung conventional as in the current conflicts, very current today. Yun pa rin yung after 56 years, Siguro after 56 years ay marami na iba na ring konfigurasyon ng politika sa Pilipinas. At pati ang mga diktador ay kinakailangan din mag-reconfigure ng paano ba maging diktador in 2077. It can't be like being a dictator in the 20th century, So siguro ay pwede pang tingnan yon. It struck me as rather anachronistic, certain ways by which things were being spoken of in 2077 as if they were happening, as if they were our events today. Parang hindi na-flesh out yung gap of time na yun. So, pagbati kay Arlo at inaabangan ko itong second sa kanyang trilohiya na tiyak ay magtatahi pa ng iba pang mga tema at mga misteryo sa kanyang naisulat na dati ng mga akda at isusulat pa.
Salamat, sir. Boss Charleston.
Actually, nasabi na rin yung ibang bagay. No?
Okay, next. Joke lang. Joke lang.
Hindi, ano ko lang kasi, nung binabasa ko kasi, parang naalala ko kasi yung naging hanap buhay ko rin minsan. No? And I think a lot of, alam ni Butch ito, kasi well, siguro isa sa mga hanap buhay ng mga writers, yung speech writing. Noong panahon, dumadaan tayo dyan sa mga phase na yan. Sumusulat ng speech sa ilang mga politiko. Tapos, hindi lang naman iisa, no? Yung kliyente mo dyan, minsan, dalawa, tatlo. Tapos pag, you don't even meet them minsan, no? Meron lang in charge and then kinakascade sa'yo yung mga kailangan sulatin. Tapos minsan, pero pag campaign season, let's say, especially pag tumatakbo sa pagka-presidente, ang daming imbitasyon, no? Itong mga, at mag-attend sila kahit anong barangay ang mag-imbita, they will attend. Tapos, so, minsan, yung dalawang magkatunggali na politiko ay mag-attend sila ng parehong event. No? So, gagawa ka ng speech for both of them or even three of them. Tapos, yung the same facts ang bibigay sa'yo, the same invitation, pero i-spin mo. No? Pwede mong i-spin na yung isa pro-administration, yung isa opposition. No? So para kang nagipagtalo sa sarili mo. No? Gagawa ka ng dalawang speech na magkatunggali. Di ba? So ano ka? No? Bilang writer. So siguro kung meron kang vlog, meron kang column, yun na lang yun sa'yo. No? Lalagay yung pangalan mo. Pero ganun yung trabaho ng writer. Na minsan yung ang dami mong laro. Sa so yun rin ang nakikita dito, no? Ang daming laro. In the end, so mula sa labas, maraming pwedeng i-spin, no? But in the end, death is death, no? Yung subject lang ang pwede mag-experience noon, no? Pinapatay siya, yung kanyang mortality, no? So death is death, mortality is mortality. At interesting rin nung bakit si Andres Soriano ang naging lyrical. No? Siya yung nagbigay ng parang point of view na humane or yun yung subjective na despite all the spinning and spinning, siya yung nagbigay nung totoo. Yung totoo yung pagkamatay, no? Yung mortality ng tao. Of course, malaki ang natin kay utang na loob natin kay Andres Soriano dahil sa San Miguel Beer. No? Maliban sa Catholicism, siguro yung San Miguel Beer ang pinamahalagang legacy ng Spanish era. Kaya siguro si Andres Soriano ang nag-dominate in the end. So I'm also interested in the idea of using Andres Soriano dito. Kasi parang hindi naman siya historical. Of course, phalangist na yung banggit ni Butch na. And when I was a boy also, naalala ko. Kasi I went to a Jesuit school. A community, maliit na community lang ako. At that time, San Juan was still. At minsan itong mga bahagi na ng community ng mga pare, no? At that time, mostly they were still Spanish, kaya mga Pilipino yan. But during when I was a boy, puro Spanish pa yan, marami. And they would come to the house, minsan invited guests, and they would declare openly, no? Not all of them, but I remember one saying, Frankista siya, di ba? Na hindi ko pa naintindihan kung anong ibig sabihin nun. They were Franco sila.
Francisco
So I think, Ah, hindi. So anyway, yun lang ang ano ko dito, no, yung palagay marami kasing nabasa itong si Arlo at ang dami niyang impluwensya at hindi ko pa rin nabasa kasi yung earlier works, no. And I think this is a very interesting ito yung the future ng Philippine literature. But then maybe there's still that voice, no, that personal spin mo nga na lalabas eventually sa dami nitong mga nauri ng nobela na gusto mong gawin. So yun lang muna.
Okay. Salamat. Ang ganda. O yung nalalabing minuto, Arlo, para sa iyo.
Maraming salamat, Sir Bim. So, maraming salamat po dun sa mga komento. Particular ko pong sisikapin ko pong tapusin ito at gawing mas kaiga-igaya yung karanasan ng pagbabasa kasi mahalaga yung na-point out kanina ni Sir Roland tungkol sa accessibility. Siguro yun nga doon papasok yung mga kung nakita niyo yung parang fake table of contents nung supposedly compendium. Ay merong part diyan na tinatawag na parang biografia militantes. So parang supposedly ang plano doon ay parang lagyan ng parang maiikling CCP encyclopedia like biographies ng supposedly mga manunulat na pwedeng ituring na reactionary o pasista para magkaroon ng parang mga bagay na pwedeng sundan yung magbabasa. Yun nga, salamat kay Sir Dun sa kay Sir Bomen, no? Particular kay Sir Bomen doon sa pag-point out sa anachronistikong aspekto nung ilang bahagi ng kasalukuyang proyekto. Actually, nung titingnan ko nga siya, sobrang ridiculous yung 2077 kasi ganun pa rin. Nung timeline malaki yung impluwensya sa akin nung backward regimes na gustong i-establish ng Taliban, no. Kaya, although of course, kahit na outwardly backward yung parang backward yung iminumungkain nilang rehimen. Of course, yung mga methods sila over the years nagbago rin. So yun yung nakalimutan kong i-take note, no. So maraming salamat dun sa pagpunta dun sa bahaging yun. Yung sisikapin ko siyang ayusin. Yun, muli, maraming salamat po sa lahat ng nagbigay ng komento. Malaki may tutulong sa proyekto.
Okay, ito po ang ating munting pagdiriwang ng Buwan ng Wika at Buwan ng Kasaysayan sa pamamagitan ng pagtaliksik o pagsusuri ng akda ni Arlo Mendoza. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay kayong lahat.
Pagbati sa proyekto at sa mga naibukas na interogasyon, Arlo Mendoza. Maraming salamat din, Sir Vim, sa inyong pagpapadaloy. Mainam na pag-uugnay ito sa ating mga nakaraang talakayan at sa susunod na workshop session. Sa isang diskusyon sa UPNWW, natalakay ang librong Spectres of Marx. Isa sa tinimbang dito ay ang mga multong nagpaparamdam sa isang mundong nalilihis o wala sa ayos. Umaandar ang ating kasaysayan at ang ating mga pagkatha sa pagtatangkang hanapin at iwasto ang mga katawang nawala at naging multo. Ganito rin kaya ang inaasam ng panulat ni Maria Amparo Pipay Warren. Para kay Pipay, ang punto-puntong yugtuba ng isang manunulat ay mga hakbang patungo sa isang pagbabalik sa ayos. Upang tulungan tayong basahin ang proyektong Juncture, 2 Stories, narito ang ating panelistang si Cristina Pantoja Jing Hidalgo.
Good morning, everyone. Are you able to hear me well enough? Hello?
Yes,
Can
ma'am.
you hear? Okay.
Yes.
I was thinking that if not, I would put on my headset. Okay, by way of introducing our writing fellow, I want to talk a bit about the short story in English by women. Yesterday, I was suggesting to Mary Ann Moll that she acquire a solid background on the historical novels written by Filipino women writing in English. I am going to make a similar suggestion to Titay. When I was beginning to write my own stories, I tried to find out who were the other Filipino women who had written before me. It wasn't that easy. We didn't have as many publishers then. The stories were published in magazines, but not collected in books. So they would disappear with the magazines. When I started publishing, the women's movement in the West had done a lot of active retrieval of early works by their women writers. So we, I mean my contemporaries and I, were very conscious of the need to know what had been done before our time. But the works in English by Filipino women tended to be overlooked because perhaps of the larger achievement of the male writers. I'm speaking of our literary canon, which was almost exclusively male. Manuel Arguilla, Nick Joaquin, NVM Gonzalez, Bienvenido Santos, Frankie Sionil Jose. Early critics would even tend to lump the women together in one chapter in their book and call that chapter Women Writers. And textbooks tended to focus only on one woman per genre. Estrella Alfon for fiction, Virgie Moreno for poetry, and Carmen Guerrero Nakpil for the essay. I'm sure the other panelists and fellows will zero in on the politics in Ms. Warren's stories. I've chosen to talk about something else. Maybe it's also political. We've come a long way from Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez, often described as the first modern short story. A long way from the Veronicans of the 1930s. My fellow panelists will remember that they were the first literary barkada in the Philippines, 12 men and a sole woman, Estrella Alfon. There were many women short story writers in the post-war period. The best known are Kerima Polotan, Edith Tiempo, and Hilda Cordero Fernando. And we remember them today because their stories were collected in books. And we now recognize that these women were actually proto-feminists. Edith and Kerima in their subject matter, which was always the situation of women in their society at that time, and Hilda in her employment of the modern fairy tale or speculative fiction to describe the trap in which the Pinay housewife of the 50s and the early 60s found herself. Ida Rivera Ford and Tita Lacambra Ayala also wrote short stories which focused on the position of women in their time, and a couple of Tita's works were early examples of speculative fiction, like Hilda Cordero Fernandez. Of course, the political short story came into its own with Ninochka Rosca, who broke ground with the collection Bitter Country and other short stories. But it is in the 90s that we saw the emergence of a large number of Filipina fictionists. I will mention them here probably for, it's kind of like, I guess I'm kind of doing a bit of the groundwork for Pipay and for whoever other women writers among you would find this interesting. Sian Abad Hugo, Sweet Summer, who wrote Sweet Summer in 1996. These are coming of age stories. Nikki Alfar, who wrote Now, Then, and Elsewhen in 2010. She writes the modern fairy tales. Merlinda Bobbies with White Turtle. Joy Dairit with The Walk. This Joy wrote mainly experimental stories, experimental in both subject matter and form. Susan Lara's Letting Go. Susan was probably the first of the Filipino women writers in English to deal explicitly with women's sexuality. Then there's Rainy Arcache Melvin, Norma Miraflor, Jessica Zafra, Her Manananggal Terrorizes Manila was quite groundbreaking, and La Cambinisitoy. In the new decade, we had even more Filipinas producing fiction. Menchu Sarmiento published Day 19 in 2003. Romina Gonzalez published We Lost It in 2003 also. Mariví Soliven Blanco published Spooky Mo, an early collection of horror fiction in 2008. Mabek Kausek published Afraid to be Chinese, probably also one of, maybe the first collection by a Chinay dealing with the situation of the Filipino-Chinese woman. And now, in the second decade of the century, we have, among others, Gabriela Lee, whose Instructions on How to Disappear, published in 2016, is speculative fiction at its best. Jenny Ortuospe, whose Fictionary, published in 2016, is a very unusual collection of horse racing stories and some darker stories set in LA. Catherine Torres, whose Mariposa Gang and Other Stories, published in 2016, is about displaced Filipinos. She's a diplomat by profession, so this is her territory. Caroline Howe, and her, who we know better as a critic, but who has now written both short stories and a novel. Caroline Howe's Recuerdos de Patay gathers together the output of 22 years, dealing both with alienated Filipinos abroad and an unusual man who works with ghosts in the Philippines because it is his job to paint portraits of the dead. In this admittedly limited survey, I have not actually encountered any stories like those of Maria Amparo Warren. Pipai's life seems to have followed a trajectory similar or familiar to us in the field. She did an MA in creative writing at the UP. She worked as copy editor for the UP Press. But after that, she went to work for the government. And it is this decision that has had an effect on her, about which she's still trying to make sense, as we may gather from her poetics essay. The latter, the poetics essay, deals rather candidly with her disillusion with the so-called writerly life, referring there to both her creative writing and the writing that she did for communications and public relations teams of the two government agencies that she worked for. That is, speeches, press statements, souvenir messages, etc. These stories that she has submitted for the workshop, I personally find quite remarkable. First of all, in terms of the language, which I think we will all recognize is extremely good. And then in terms of the sophistication of her writing techniques. For instance, the way she uses the second person, you, in the first story, Gray Area, and the experimental story, Here for the Harvest, with its fragmented bricolage type of structure. I also find that I can't quite place her in the tradition of women's fiction in English, which I have earlier outlined, perhaps because of her subject matter. The young mother, that's how she is identified, the protagonist of the first story, works in what Pipai herself describes as the fractured arena of cyberspace. And the second story unfolds in a series of emails, press releases, and speeches written for one, Agriculture Minister Juan Lardo Gaucho. This newness is both an advantage and a disadvantage for a writer. On the one hand, the material is new and therefore by itself interesting. And because it is new, readers will perhaps not quite know how to react to it. I personally, when I first read it, wasn't sure what an SEO was. And I had to explain to me what it was. I mean, what it is. Anyway, I find the work of Pipay very exciting. And it is now, that is it for my introduction. We will now, what happens next? I forget. Will Pipay say something? I think that's it, right? She will say something about her work. Go ahead, Pipay. Hello?
Hi there.
Okay,
Okay. Everyone can hear me?
yes.
All right. Thank you very much. I have a very short presentation, nothing too heavy, just to show you, I guess, the journey that I've started on when it comes to what I call maybe like my second darker, edgier sophomore album of writing, since this is writing that I classify as following my first significant body of work, which were my short stories for my Master of Arts collection. This presentation is called Collected Notes on Marking the Way, subtitled Finding Direction in My Writing in the Space-Time of Pandemic and Misinformation, which is the time that we ourselves are living in. Next, please. So let me just give you a quick summary about my current project as well vis-a-vis how it relates to my past projects. These are the first two short stories I've written after completing a full manuscript with something for a fixed vision of itself. If you've ever completed a creative writing thesis, whether undergraduate or graduate, you know that the collection has to have some kind of invisible seam that ties it together, and then you have to defend it with some sort of argument. So my argument before was that storytelling for me was a scheme in which I would find my way. So that was the vision that I had for my previous stories. But I've named this suite, so far it's just a short suite of a couple of stories with some seeds for future stories on the way. I've named this suite Juncture because I think that it is the best possible approximation right now of my departure from my previous poetics. I presented two stories for the UP National Writers Workshop 60th edition. The first one is called Gray Area. It follows a stream of consciousness style prose, and it's about work that was previously done, probably still is done right now, but with techniques that have since fallen out of fashion, called gray hat tactics of search engine optimization. So that is what the first story pertains to. The second story is a bricolage style collection, something quite similar to the previous co-fellow discussed, Arlo. It also takes the form of found pieces, bricolage of old souvenir messages, press releases, feature articles, week interviews from a weekly magazine that you'll be able to see. You'll be able to deduce from the forms presented in the short stories. So, upon further reflection, I intend for these stories to be part of another short story collection whose themes revolve more around artifice, untruth, moral grayness, and personal and collective implication, among others. Next slide, please. So here's just like a short word bank of the ideas that I was playing around with in my previous vision, in my first short story collection, that may somewhat echo in these next two stories. So I'm fascinated with space-time, what is fixed space-time and fluctuating space-time, finding one's way, discovering things, interrogating one's place or position in the narrative. I like to take a spatio-temporal approach to emplotment, which means that I determine the flow of the story. I implot the story as much based on place as on a particular time or chronology. In my stories, I guess, both past and present, there's the intention to take my readers on different journeys across real or imagined or physical or metaphysical spaces. I think there's still a trace of that in the stories that I presented for this workshop. And crafting different markers that serve as epiphanies. Next slide, please. But what I bring to you today is a discussion on how my current writing diverges from my previous writing. So just so you know, first, I'm writing from a less optimistic place, but I don't think this is necessarily new to any of us who isn't writing from a less optimistic place, given that the worlds outside of the rooms that we're sitting in are burning. Second, the characters that I envision now when I start writing my stories are less oriented towards the hero archetype. When I was first writing my stories, it was also a process of like getting to know myself, my dreams, my ambitions. Not a lot of them hold today. And so now when I write characters, these are characters who don't know what to dream about considering the kind of world that they're in, or who are questioning the dreams that society has put forward to them, that they have to do things a certain way or they have to contribute to someone else's growth in a certain way. Third, I'm interested in the collective or composite point of view involved in a narrative, which can either unify it or complicate it even further. And fourth, I guess most importantly, what the kind of approach that I'm bringing into the work that I'm doing right now and that I hope you can engage me on. Though I know I'm writing from a world that was initially very small, I don't want to shy away from conversations about politics, privilege, complicity, the evil things that people can do even from a place of innocence, and the coexistent potential and limits of something like art in instigating social change. Next slide, please. Here's my personal stake on the matter, why I'm doing this, in case it's a point of interest to the people who are watching this presentation. First, I'm doing this because I want to examine the things that prevent me or have something like have established some kind of distance within me, the things that prevent me from speaking about my previous life or my previous work, in the hopes that doing so will help others understand what happens behind the scenes, especially with regard to the little corruptions that happen in offices, in meetings, over email exchanges, and the gradual misdirections that ordinary people find themselves being subject to. Because a lot of the time in political stories, the narrative is very much centered on the loud characters. But what about the loud characters, the ones who are mythologized? But what about the ones who do the mythologizing or the nitty gritty work for them? That's what I'm interested also in this fiction that I'm writing now. Second, I still want my writing to engage with the realities of here and now. That's just the best that I can hope for them, that if someone chances upon them, they'll find the themes and the subjects relevant to the kind of world that we're living in now, as opposed to the stories that we encounter and then we think it's like we're staring into an alien world. So yun, I want my writing to engage with the realities of the here and now, whatever that means, whatever that will come to mean in the future. Third, I want to be less scared of coming clean to an audience if it can contribute to the wider conversation on myth-making, fake news, corrupt systems, and the like. And fourth, since I am teaching again, I want to be ready to facilitate difficult conversations with my students about how these things relate to the practice of writing, because I think it's obvious to everyone right now the modes of production and modes of distribution for literature have changed and are still very much subject to change now that we're in the pandemic and we can't produce or launch or have book launches exactly the way that we used to before. And we're thinking about the kind of environment that we're going to be releasing new literary work in. And I know that I'm going to be discussing that as it relates to the practice of writing with my students. And I would love also to open up similar conversations with you, my co-fellows and my panelists. Next slide, please. I would be extremely grateful for the feedback of the panelists and fellows on the following issues, if you have any. First, if it's on the table, the scope of my poetics. Second, whether I've realized the key ideas in the forms that I chose. Third, what further dimensions I can explore for the characters. And fourth, what I should or shouldn't have left out in the conversations that I started in my stories, among others. Next slide, please. It is a tremendous honor to have taken part in the workshop and to have met peers and instructors who are doing the valuable work of keeping the conversation going, when it is, more often than not nowadays, the easier option to be silent. Thank you so much. Ma'am, nakamute po yata kayo.
So yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was on mute. You may now ask your questions or make your comments.
Sige, mag-notes ako. Notes time.
Anyone? Okay, so the first one on the queue is Eric. Go ahead, please. Oops.
Nakamute din, Eric.
Ayun, sorry. Di pa, congrats dito. Actually, na-appreciate ko yung gray hat, black hat, and white hat, mga ganyan. Siyempre kasi natsambahan naman na alam ko yung gano'n. Pero siyempre, minsan kapag gumagamit talaga tayo ng mga technical or super na mga hindi alam talaga ng mga tao, parang minsan make or break, parang tipong kapag ang nakabasa ay alam yon or nakaka-relate doon or may connection, nagiging solid instantly yung connection. Pero kapag hindi pa nila yon alam, parang it's something na they would skip. Na parang, ano ba to? Ano kaya itong sinasabi dito? It's either sa search pa nila or ano. Pero I guess naman, hindi pa naman natin alam, hindi ko pa alam yung mga hindi mo pa na isasubmit na part netong works. No? So baka naman meron pang mga part na mas in-explain mo yung mga nangyayari sa mga field na yan. Tapos, anyway, isa pa, no? Tama naman, magkadugtong yung kwento, no? Yung two stories, magkadugtong naman sila, no? Or same universe. Tapos, isa pang last na lang na question ko, hindi naman siya comment. I know that it's a choice of the author na pinili yung setting, yung time. Ano ba siya, 2055? Futuristic na setting. Bakit gusto ko lang din malaman, mahalaga ba na yun yung time para dun sa mismong kwento or tutuloy naman ba yung kwento if it was told in the present time or kaya wherein or when ang mga terminology, yung species, yung mga lugar or mismo mga pangalan or mga kung ano-ano mang mga bagay is mas relatable. Kasi minsan, halimbawa, may bagong term, may bagong species na mababanggit tapos parang iisipin mo pa kung ano kaya yun. Pero sa pagkakakwento naman ni Pipay ay naiintindihan naman natin agad. Basa-basahin lang natin ng tuloy-tuloy. No? Pero yun nga lang, syempre mas may another wall siya sa nagbabasa Kasi parang himbis na diretso, halimbawa ang ginamit mo ay galunggong. Galunggong ay tawag dito ay extinct na sa panahon na 'yon. Pero hindi na kailangan pang mag-isip ng ng readers parang instant connection na okay sa panahon na to wala na. O kaya ganun. So anyway, gusto ko lang malaman na how essential ba na gumamit ka ng ibang timeline or panahon bukod lang sa dahil ito ay choice mo. Yun lang. Thank you po.
May I ask lang, Eric, if you could repeat the question in like just one statement lang. Ano ba yun talagang tanong? Is it necessary
po ba na the story was told in setting ng 2055 or the futuristic setting or is it the same kung if it was told in the present time?
In the present.
Yes po.
Okay. Is it necessary to set it in some imaginary future time?
Yes.
Rather than in the present. Okay. The next in line is Mary Ann. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Congrats, Pipay. Nag-enjoy ako sa pagbabasa. I especially like gray area because yung storytelling mo, parang dalawang points of view. Tapos, yung isa pang innovation mo doon, you use the second person point of view. Tapos, kahit na in-explain mo na yung gray area doon is the gray hat that you have already discussed earlier. Na-familiar din ako kasi dati beat reporter din ako sa isang online news rag based in New York. Graveyard shift ako, kanda puyat-puyat. And we had a specific way of merong back-end na ina-upload namin mismo. Kami mismo nag-upload ng mga stories namin. There is a way of writing it na lumalabas siya sa mga yung top ranked search articles ng Google, parang gano'n. I forgot, it was 2015 pa. So I'm familiar with the concept. Hindi naman ako nahirapan mag-process noon. But what I really, really like is as I focus more on the story of the young mother and the one that she's writing about, and wala naman sa kanilang pinangalanan, parang ang naging question sa akin, and I think this is the point of the story, is it kanino ba talagang kwento yon? Who is really telling the story? Is it the politician imagining the reality of the young mother and implotting that into his own narrative? Or is it the young mothers? Baliktad ba talaga siya? So ito yung second gray area na more on the technique of the storytelling and nasa surface lang yung gray area ng SEO. So I really, really enjoyed that story. I think it's very well written, tight na tight, very, very quiet, pero it resonated with me. Mas marami akong tanong dito sa second story mo kasi like what Eric brought up kanina, this is set in 5055. So 3,000 years hence. So pag ganun ka far away into the future, palagi I would expect something na mas malaki ang difference from what we're experiencing now. But apparently in your story, even 3,000 years hence, people still use email, meron pa ring miscommunication, like mentioned in one of the emails, there are still governments and government bureaucrats, siguro nga government is forever, and there is still state-sponsored violence, and environmental problems still exist. We're still facing the same problems we're having now, 3,000 years into the future. Hindi pa ba tayo, parang I would expect by that time, completely annihilated na siguro tayo. Or kahit hindi completely, to some degree, may destruction na nangyari and possible rebirth. So, yun yung question ko kasi I was thinking, aside from the indicators na merong...
Excuse me, Mary Ann.
Yes po.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but could you try to shorten your comment and ask
Okay.
the question that you wish to ask, because there are quite a number of people in the queue.
Okay po. So my question is, aside from the indicators of the different species, kung i-date mo ba siya na closer to the current time, do you think you will still get your point across? Mas magiging urgent ba yung message mo? And then, my second question is, at the end, wala namang kasing resolution. There was, parang nag-trail off lang yung kwento. Is it really your intention na wag maglagay ng resolution, considering na this is 3,000 years into the future? So those are my two questions.
Okay, so thank you, Mary Ann. So the first question is similar to Eric's. If you were to set it in the present, would it make any difference? And the second is, did you really intend not to have any resolution for your story? Is that right, Mary Ann?
Yes po.
Okay, so we go to the third person in the line. I'm sorry, can you help me, Rona? I have a hard time reading. Vix. Yeah, Vix.
Okay, Vix muna.
Ano, Ma'am Jing, it's Sir Butch first.
Hi.
You is Sir Butch, and then Anna, Sir June, and then me.
Oh, that's not the way it is in my. All right. So Butch first.
Okay,
Sorry,
thanks.
Butch.
Yeah, I agree with the two observations before me. The questions are also mine, but I'd like to focus additionally on the first story, which I really like, because it again speaks to the matter of complicity and how we ourselves help support regimes like this, sometimes because of necessity, at the sacrifice of personal happiness or fulfillment. A couple of things. First, technically, the idea of using the second voice, having an addressee, a you, and I know that the absent politician is being constructed here. It's a very interesting technique, but I don't think it's followed through quite comprehensively enough. In other words, the story, if you must use the you, the story has to, I think, begin and end with you, with the you, so that we complete an arc there. So what has the you come to after telling this story of the other one, of the woman in the story? What has that brought him to? So there's that story, overarching story of the you that you have to establish. Otherwise, if you retell this in just the plain third person, you might lose that kind of effect, but might also gain some clarity. It's really, that decision must be based on how important this you is to you as the author, and what you want to make of him. It's the writer character here, while she's engaged in search engine optimization, which brings it up to date, is really just the latest in the long line of actors in this political drama. And again, I appreciate it because, as many of you know, I've been there before. I've been writing speeches for presidents and politicians and whoever. I know this situation very intimately, and in fact wrote a play about it. But my second point, and maybe again a larger one, is the resolution of this story, even realizing that, as you say, you were coming from a less optimistic place. less optimistic is not necessarily desperate to me. It may be that the whole world is against you, but she has already begun taking steps to do something else. In other words, what I'm looking for is some element of redemption. I'm not saying that she suddenly should, find happiness somewhere. It's not as simple as that, but something that she does for herself, aside from quitting her job, which will reaffirm that she still values the writer in her. Whether it's just a first line or a first page of something. I think it's important. Again, this is the author's philosophical choice. You can choose as dismal a world as you want, devoid of hope. But what are you telling writers and artists? Ginagamit tayo, hindi tindihan naman natin yon, pero alam naman natin ginagamit tayo, susuko na lang ba tayo? Anong pamamaraan what are creative forms of resistance by which we retrieve ourselves? And again, I'm saying that from a very personal point of view because I was there. In fact, it was Doc Tiempo who told me in Dumaguete, which is why I went back to school, knowing that I was engaged in that kind of work. He told me, Butch, save your soul. And so I went back to school. So I think it's very important to think about that, at least, to consider the element of resistance here in which resigning may not be enough. Kasi ang dismal ng mundo na to. Parang ito yung basahin mo yung caps and lowercase ni Manuel Argilla, ang dilim-dilim din ng pananaw nun eh. Parang wala ka nang pupuntahan. Everything is just collapsing around you. And again, I accept na, there are situations like that. But that has been done zillions of times before. You will not be telling us anything new in that respect. What we want, what people today really need to know is how do we get out of this mess? And if you can contribute to that, I think your story will be much more helpful. Salamat.
Okay, thank you, Butch. So the points brought up by Butch were, first of all, what was the value of using the you, the second person point of view? Did it contribute to clarity? Because in the story, the story does not end with the you. It begins with the you, but it doesn't go back to the you. So that's kind of left up there in the air. And then regarding the resolution of the story, he's suggesting a resolution that would include a more creative form of resistance by which the writer might retrieve himself or herself. Okay, the next in line is Anna. Go ahead, please, Anna.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, Ma'am Jing, pa-promote ko lang dahil may August promo ako. Short story writer din po ako. Meron po akong August promo ng books in case you're interested. May libreng ceramics.
Sorry, Anna,
so, yan. Yes, thank you. Saying that, I'm also a short story writer. And I'm actually working on a third book, this time speculative fiction. So I'm very interested in Pipai's project, actually. And one of my questions is what goes on into the decision to what goes on into the decision to write these stories? I mean, are you writing them individually as they come, collecting them over the years, or are you writing them solely for a collection? Because, in recent years, that's really what younger writers have begun to do. They've begun to think of in terms of books, no? collections talaga. So that's one question. My second question has to do, is very much related to Sir Butch's points. Sorry, sinundan ko na naman si Sir Butch, pero hindi po iba yung sasabihin ko. In fact, my question is, do you think of your stories as mimetic or yun nga, resistant/redemptive? No? Kasi, and this is to address, I think, Eric's point as well about kailangan ba talagang malayong-malayo in the future yung setting, kasi that is how science fiction works, through cognitive estrangement, no, or what many of us really know as really an extreme form of defamiliarization. So there's a lot of things that you can do precisely with that distance. No, that distance from reality. It actually allows us to look at our present more clearly, no? Which is why I suppose there's a lot of transgressive potential with speculative fiction, no? So that's what I want to ask. Kasi kung tipong mimetic nga lang yung project, parang okay na yung ganito, na parang walang redemption, no, na parang things as is, no? Thousands of years later, ganito lang talaga yung gobyerno, no? And that's actually fine in a sense, kasi I mean, it's one of the source of pleasures for me in this text. Ang absurd kasi niya na centuries, thousands of years later, millennia later, exactly ganito pa rin. But I guess that's why I also asked during our consultation, parang nabitin ako, no? Kasi now that you've set this world, what do we want to do about it? And here, I think I also brought up Gregorio Brillantes, no? Particularly the second collection, Apollo Centennial. I brought up yung A Mission for Heroes, which is really this parang ginawang action genre. Pero actually tungkol lang siya sa bureaucratic coffee table book project, no, na basta involving jungles and helicopters. Pero it's really all supposed to be absurd and making fun of precisely the ministries and the bureaucracy in Marcos's time. And then there's Apollo Centennial, no, na napaka parang sad actually nung setting, kasi nga years and years later, again, the future, exactly ganun pa rin. And yet, how it ends kasi shows you a glimmer of hope. The existence precisely of pockets of resistance. Opo, kahit yung sa language pa lang may resistance na. Dito kasi, I mean, we saw that angle, the rebels. Pero parang we don't really know what happened to it, kasi nga in the end, tinabunan lang siya ng bagong project, ng more propaganda. So it might be interesting, I suppose. Personally, that was what I was looking for. Parang anong nangyari doon? No, doon sa ganong angle na yan. Parang we get like a clear picture of this world. I guess in terms of the goal of these stories, that was what I was concerned with. Yun lang. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. My apologies that I did not mention you in my review of the contemporary fictionist, no? Hindi talaga siya kompleto. In fact, ang mga hindi yata nasali, yung mga kaibigan ko. Si Andrea Pasion Flores, nakalimutan ko rin banggitin. So, apologies. But regarding the questions of Anna, the first one is, what is the project actually? Are you just writing individual short stories, or do you have a collection in mind? And the second question is similar to Butch's. Is your fiction intended to be merely mimetic, even when it is set in the future? Excuse me. Or do you foresee wanting to also be redemptive? And the example that you mentioned is a very interesting one, Apollo Centennial by Gregorio Brillantes, which is also set in the future, also a terribly grim future, but there is the introduction of the resistance, which exists and therefore provides the note of hope. Next, we have June.
Hi,
Sige,
Pipay.
June.
Yung lagi akong fascinated magbasa ng mga akda na hindi ko kayang gawin. Ang i-address ko dito yung pangalawang short story mo. yung ang ikli-ikli, ang dami-daming laman. Na yung nung nire-review ko na to, lagi naman yung pagbibigay mo ng alternative reality. Eh kaya nga tayo fictionist kasi lagi tayong merong mali sa sistema. Kaya nga hindi mabubuhay ang writer pag walang conflict. Dahil totoo naman yung conflict sa buhay mo tapos pag mag-imagine ka pa ulit ng conflict. So yung tinignan ko itong story number 2, para siyang collection na agad ng isang buong project. Isa-isahin ko sa iyo yung mga ideas na gusto kong mabasa na short din. Halimbawa, yung A Monument of the Bug-Eyed. So isang story yun eh. Monument. So nung araw, 0 yun. So ano talaga nangyari? Intro yun. Tapos, yung napaka-powerful itong almost farcical yung itong pagpuri-puri sa idea number 2 sa state proclaimed artist kay Hex Bugarillo. Ang dami nun. State of culture yun eh. Kung paano siya naging state proclaimed artist. Yun lang term na state proclaimed artist. Eh, napakalalim na komentaryo na noon. Ano na nabago sa kultura na nung pagdating ng maraming panahon na yon. Tapos, yung centuries ago before rampant urbanization. Yung rampant urbanization na yon, malimit kasi pag nag-sci-fi yung mga tao, technology lang eh. Yung of course may technology rito, pero dito yung human condition ay andi dito. Ano na yung condition nung sa panahon na yon? Nabago ba? So yung climate change ay hindi siya statement. But rather, ano na yung climate change sa panahon ng yung ano mo. So yung sabi ko nga, these are many stories na short na napaka-powerful. Eh gusto ko ring makilala, bibilisan ko na, si Watel Guan. Gusto ko siyang makilala. Gusto ko ring makita si Hansa Mann's Presidential Commission. Etc. At yung huli si Father President. So, parang nakikita kong project, Pipay, gumagawa ka ng mga sketches. Yung sa mga small sketches na ito ay merong bigger picture kang nabubuo. Na ang natutuwa ako dito, akala mo ang maliliit. Akala mo farce lang ng nangyayari ngayon. Pero it's pushing beyond eh. And lastly, huwag ka nang magduda. Mahusay kang magsulat. It does not matter kung ano yung sasabihin namin. Wala, pang-ego lang yun. Ang gusto kong marinig sa dulo, ano ngayon? Yung sinusulat mo. Saan ka papunta? Ano yung susunod mo? Kasi naiintriga ako yung dare mo to confront power eh. Pagkatapos yung subversion as fiction. Ano ito? Sloganeering lang ba ito? Parang nabanggit ni Boots. Ano ba to? Nagrarant ka lang ba? O so sa dulo, ano ba yung talagang, ano yung alternative reality na nasa isip mo na siyang nagsusustain ng fiction mo? Of course, yung story 1 mo ay maganda rin yon. Kaya lang gusto ko lang dito mag-focus. Just keep on writing. Isang araw, makakatanggap ka rin ng mga death threat. Isang araw, mapa-fire ka din sa trabaho. Isang araw, mapuputulan ka rin ng kuryente. Pag dumating yung lahat ng ganon, asa na yung fiction mo? Ibig kong sabihin, hindi naman ina-idealize yung fiction. No? I mean, hindi ina-idealize lang siya. But you're already there. Ang tapang-tapang mo mag-confront. And I like it. And I respect you for that. Ang gusto kong makita, ano ang isusulat mo next? Thank you, Pipay.
Okay, thank you, June. I guess what June was saying is that in the story number 2, what he read were really basically just sketches,
Right.
and that his suggestion was that each one could be developed into a fuller story. And then the second question was, where are you going from here? I don't know whether later I will want to answer that, but I think in her poetic thesis, she did say that she was still searching, that she wasn't quite sure where she wanted to go, but she did say something about using writing as a form of activism on the net. Maybe she can elaborate on that a little later. I'm going to call now on, who's next in the line?
Si Roland.
Hindi ko makita yung,
Si Roland yata, Jing.
is it Roland? Nawala sa ano ko eh.
Si Vic.
Si
Okay,
Vix po,
hindi,
si Vix.
si Vix, tapos si Arlo, tapos si Roland. So, Vix first.
Thank you, Ma'am Jing. First of all, congratulations, Pipay. I'm really excited to have read your work again. I read your first collection, and of course, being part of the same like graduate classes. I really enjoyed also your previous stories from that chapbook. But what I find really interesting now is your tama na, you even said this in your poetics that you took a turn, no? And I think this is coming from that time that you worked in government. Siyempre, alam ko yung mga chika ni Pipay, ganyan na. So I'm glad that you're able to parang put that experience also in your stories, and all these writing about parang the trying to resist and yet being complicit and having that tension. But so yun nga, but so my comments really are more on like language, and your language is very good as usual na like what Jing said. But I suppose yung sa first story, it's okay no kasi si she and you, the third person and the second person there, okay yung mix na. I really found it fascinating kasi ang hirap i-plot ng gano'n na minsan nakakalito kung kailan ka ba, kung sino na yung nagsasalita or pa sino na yung ilalagay mo or something. But really well done there. In the second though, and I guess this is where most of the comments are also from the other fellows and panelists, I suppose yung registers lang of the language kasi iba-ibang, yun nga, no, ano siya, Bicolage din siya, iba-ibang, well, mostly article siya, no, in parang feature, news features or articles that show us itong world na to. And again, like what others said, I love that world building that you have. And may emails, so merong news articles and then may emails. But yun nga, parang for me, the register, it does seem like it's written or the same person is speaking all throughout. And I don't know if that's deliberate na parang he has to really, it's just one person writing the whole thing. Ewan ko kung may ganong angle. But that's siguro yun yung parang mas ano ko na, I don't know if maybe you can address that later, but I was hoping na parang medyo may konting variety doon sa registers and how the emails and the news articles are written. Kasi minsan kunwari may yung news article na isa dito or yung feature na very may maraming pagpuput in ng author ng sarili niya, yung ini-interview niya si Gaucho, and yet there's also the author there. So parang that for me is that stood out because it sounded different from the others. So parang biglang may tao ka dito na parang ang intrusive, na parang yung nangi-interview na he makes it about himself and not about the interviewed anymore, yung mga ganun. So parang I like those touches. But I hope that it was parang, yun nga, medyo mas may konting variety in the registers in the second story. So that's all. Thank you. And congratulations.
Okay, thank you, Vic. So her Vic's comment had to do with the use of what seems to be just one language register in the second story, and which she feels would be more effective if the different fragments were using different language registers. Next, we have Arlo.
Okay po. Mabilis lang po yung akin. Una, pagbati kay Pipay. Yung unang story nung nabasa ko, sabi ko, shit, kindred spirits. Diba? Kasi parang, in a way, parang, yan, yung mga ganitong proyekto, interesting sa akin. No? Lalo na yung sa usapin ng komplisidad. Tapos yun nga, meron ring pagtatangkang gumamit ng isang rarely used na POV. So second person. Gets ko kung bakit yun ginamit. No? Dahil yung second person point of view, natural yun, nanduduro. isip ko kaugnay nung nung SEO stuff nung kwento. Ewan ko kung familiar, mas magmumungkahi na lang ako ng pwedeng tignan kasi halos naman buo na ito. Ewan ko kung familiar ka sa grupong or collective na Pedantic Pedestrian. So based sila sa Baguio, mga taga UP Baguio sila. So, meron silang project, no? At yung project nila ay tungkol sa kung ano yung nasa last page ng Google search, no? So yun lang, kinompile nila yung nasa last page ng Google search. Nagta-type lang sila ng random words, no? Ano yung nasa last page ng, kunwari, sinearch ko sa sa search engine, buwan ng wika. Ano yung nasa pinaka, kunwari, 100 page ng search engine? Ano yung lumalabas doon? So parang tingin ko, yung magdadagdag ng, tingin ko, added layer, humor, siguro humor, kung humor man matatawag. Ay, ano kaya yung, yung katabi ng mga nababury na, ano na yung katabing mga content ng nababury na content sa what could have been. So interesting sa akin yung part na yun. So ba pwede mo i-check out kung ano na yung mga yung project na yun. No? Yung pangalawang kwento naman nung nabasa ko, medyo similar yung reaction ko doon sa reaction ni Sir Jun in that ako naman ang reaction ko, ito yung mga gusto kong nakawin na nakawin na proyekto eh. Kaya lang nagawa na so hindi ko na pwede nakawin. No? So ayun, no. So yun yung una kong reaction, no. Tapos naisip ko, meron agad akong naisip nung nabasa ko yung nabasa ko yung pangalawang kwento. Tingin ko familiar kay sa kanya kasi recent fellow naman siya dito sa UP National Writers Workshop. Pag binasa niyo yung yung kakalabas lang na libro ni Tilde Acuña, no, yung Oroboro, no. Meron siyang isang meron siyang isang part nung kwento niya, yung klasiko katalogo. Tapos ganun rin, no, puro mga found text, no. Kung dito, parang ini-imagine mo yung artistic production, intellectual work, etc., agribusiness in the future. Kay doon naman dun sa kwento niya, no, dun sa kwento ni Tilda, yung klasiko katalogo na nandun sa Oroboro. Ang ini-imagine naman niya doon, ano kaya yung yung sitwasyong pang-edukasyon sa anyo ng mga syllabus at mga conference abstracts kapag nag-take over na nga yung mga kunwari, pagka na-realize halimbawa yung Marcosian comeback, parang ganun. So, ayun, ewan ko, pwede mo i-check out yun. Meron sa YouTube Press, Oroboro at iba pang mga. So, yun lang sa akin. No? Pero muli, pagbati, people. Galing.
Thank you, Arlo. So, Arlo has 2 suggestions. I think, though I'm not sure, Arlo, kung suggestion mo ba yung maganda yung tungkol dun sa buried content. Are you suggesting na isali yon ni Pipay sa kanyang kwento o sumulat siya ng bagong kwento na doon naman magfo-focus doon sa buried content?
Depende po, ma'am. Depende po sa kanya kasi alam naman po niya yung larangan na yan.
Oo. So, yung tinatrabaho ng mga tao na i-bury yung mga ibang content, yun ang sisilipin niya, no? Maganda. Tapos yung isa, yung suggestion niya, yung klasiko katalogo na baka gusto mo rin tignan daw, dahil interesante din siya. Okay, moving on now to Roland.
Yes, may newness sa project na ito ni Pipay dahil yung topics, yung approach niya sa pag-attack or pagsulat ng mga topics na pinili niya, plus the experimentation in form, which I like. No? Parang nawawala yun, lalo na for short process na maging experimental din sa form. No? However, parang in both stories, baka ako nagka-feeling ng pagiging bitin kasi ay medyo maikli at punctuated. Kagad ba nag-end na kagad yung mga stories sa ganun. I think ang suggestion ko kay Pipay, dalawa rin. Una ay kailangan may focus siguro. Yung first story is about yung decision to not to work anymore for the content provider, no. Pero hindi ako na-motive, wala akong ample understanding on why she just decided not to work. I did not feel so much of the tension as she go through yung pagsusulat ng content for the pork shop restaurant, yung mga ganun ba. A bit of dabbling kung ano ba yung mga what's working through her thoughts or through her reality dito, rather than just talking about mortgages, etc. Okay yun, pero and it adds on why she took in the job Pero if she was this competitive, why didn't she take on other jobs? No? As a writer for ADB, mga ganyan, etc. So bakit ito? So wala rin akong idea kung bakit ito yung what is behind her motivation. So baka kailangan may focus. I see your stories as oscillating within a certain kind of world. Maganda yung world na yun, yung worlding na ginagawa mo in which the characters or the story will move. No? Pero hindi siya nag-gravitate for me. Merong attempt to gravitate, pero saan ba nang ia-anchor itong mundo na ito? Lalo na sa second story. Parang wala akong nakitang transformation. So yung second suggestion ko is to look more into the idea of agency. Why the characters will decide the way they do in your stories. No? Kasi at the end, then, there has to be motivation for those kinds of decisions para malinaw kung bakit niya pinili mag-resign, or sa second story ay malinaw ang interlocution ng magiging layering to mga text na to be able to come into certain kinds of transformation by the end of the stories. But congratulations, Pipay. Well done.
Okay, thank you, Roland. I think Roland was pleased with the experimentation, but he was suggesting that you need to clarify certain things, increase the tension perhaps, make the motivation a little clearer. And then for the second story, he was asking what was the transformation that took place as a result of all of this. You know, I'm going to say something to, if I might, wala na yata nakapila. May nakapila pa ba? Luna, you want to? Go ahead, Luna. Luna, nakamute ka.
Okay. Maikli lang yung comment ko, Pipay, and ang gusto ko lang sabihin ay I was impressed with your work. It's more of recommending other areas and other topics that you may explore. And I'd like to recommend the area of climate change since yung combination of the kind of scientific thinking that I've seen in your prose can be utilized even further if you'll explore the topic of climate change. May gusto ko yung pagiging speculative rin niya kasi meron siyang awareness na interconnected ang mga pangyayari. At yung usapin din kasi ng climate change na gusto kong magawa mo somehow dun sa mga future works mo ay mas papataasin yung ante in the sense na kasama yung paksa, pero kasama rin yung pag-theorize kung bakit nagkaganito o kung papaano natin talaga siya dapat isipin bilang isang phenomena. So, ganun lang kaikli yung comment ko, Ma'am Jean. I have no other comments on her style or her yung grammar or excellent. Salamat po.
Okay, thank you, Luna. So Luna's suggestion is just that you might want to take up climate change as one of your themes. You know? Bowman, I think, by the way, how much time do we have left? Are we going over time or are we okay still? Rona?
20 minutes pa daw po, ma'am. Okay pa ho.
Okay. So Bowman, please go ahead with your comment.
Salamat, Ma'am Jing. Binabati ko rin si Pipay. No? Natuwa talaga ako dito sa mga piyesa niya. No? At yun nga, kung parang magkasunod sila ni Arlo at na para magkahawig nga no kung tutuusin yung mga pamamaraan at bagamat hindi naman nawawala yung originality ng dalawa. Talagang magkaibang direction din nila dinadala yung kanilang mga piyesa at may sariling very bright areas, very creative spots At siguro yung unang kwento ay nakakatuwa dahil it's a very honest description of a kind of dilemma, yung unang kwento at na-imagine ko talaga na yun ay maaaring mangyari. Siguro yung isa pang pwedeng explore ni Pipay ay kaugnay ng, diba, katrabaho sa mga troll farms, ano? Bilang isang related kind of practice, ano? Kung ang trabaho ng writer, ano, dito ay gumawa ng mga posts, ano, at ng mga articles na makapagpapataas ng Google presence, ano, ng isang politiko. Nandun naman your reverse side, no, yung mga troll armies, ano, troll farms, using, ano, also highly technological methods, ano, to undermine, no, mga political adversaries, no. Ngayon, kaya pala nagkaroon ako ng idea tungkol dun sa nabanggit ko kay Arlo kanina ng paggamit ng mga pictures dahil nakita ko dun sa iyo ngayon paggamit mo ng yung mga larawan, no, mga pictures sa iyong, I think that's also another interesting direction, no? Magpasok ng konting visuality doon sa ating text, ano? Again pa man, yun nga, naisip ko yung mga comments ng iba tungkol doon sa 3,000 years later. Parang pag binabasa ko itong obra na ito, na Here for the Harvest, mas naisip ko na it's a kind of parallel world rather than a future world, ano? So, siguro baka mas pwede mong i-frame yun as a kind of parallel universe rather than a future iteration of our present, ano? So, siguro mas may iwasan na ilang mga problema na yon kapag ganun yung ating framing. At yun nga, gusto ko itong, syempre, kung sana mapahaba at magkaroon ng iba pang mga sanga, ano, pagsasanga-sanga ang proyektong ito, ay talagang inaabangan at talagang excited ako mabasa. So, salamat, Pita.
Thank you, Bomen. So yung suggestions ni Bomen, baka pwedeng one possible subject would be the troll farms, which do the opposite of what your character was doing, no? Which was collecting favorable articles about the politician. Yung troll farms, of course, are geared toward destroying people, no? And then yung instead of going too far into the future, which was something that many of the comments showed that the fellows and the panelists had some problems with the future. Maybe a parallel universe, woman was suggesting. May isa lang akong idadagdag, no? Tapos na yata yung wala na yatang nakapila. I mentioned to Pipay when we were in consultation last Tuesday that my impression is that she had deliberately distanced herself from her material. All her techniques, for example, the use of you, where you're not so sure whether the one talking is the narrator of the story is third person ba o second person? Kaninong kwento ba talaga ito? Dun sa you o dun sa young mother? And then in the second story, the fragmentation, where parang all the characters are hidden behind their texts, no? So I was asking her whether this distancing was deliberate. And whether it had to do with the fact that she had turned her back on this life. And while she was trying to confront it, at the same time, she was trying to distance herself from it. That was what I thought might have been one of the things that she had to settle in her mind. And then secondly, is the style that I think she favors, which is understatement. Diba, Pipa, your style is very understated. So the conflict is understated. The resolution is also understated. I am very sympathetic toward that because that is also my preferred style. Diyan, ayoko ng overstatement, ayoko yung masyadong maraming drama, mga histrionics, ganyan, ano. The danger lang with understatement is that you might efface the emotion. In trying to restrain it, you might obliterate it so that the reader doesn't see it and might not understand where you really wanted to take him. That's why I think questions arose as to ano nangyari dun sa ano na nangyari kay you. Hindi naman siya talaga ang importante, it is the young mother, di ba? But what was it that you were trying to say about the young mother? What is it exactly that prompted the decision, and how did she feel about it afterwards? So I'm not suggesting that you change your style. I'm only pointing to one possible danger when you use that style, that you might efface the emotion when what you want to do is just to restrain it. Mukhang tapos na ba? Please invite Miss Pipay. Oh, okay. Sorry. So, Pipay, you have the last word.
Oh, well, thank you. Buti na lang kasi, well, I don't have that much to say, so pwede tayo early lunch. But first of all, I have to say I'm extremely thankful for first for the range, second for the degree of feedback that I've received. And these are maybe second, not yet third. Definitely not first drafts, but maybe they're about second drafts. And I did have this inkling about, I don't know, I know that I knew that I needed to clarify certain things, but I still had a very abstract thought about what those things could be. And so I'm very thankful about the specifics, I guess, that I was able to take away from the questions that you proffered here for the session. I am particularly appreciative about the questions with regard to grounding the story's time, whether it's meant to be parallel or futuristic, or what difference it would make if, let's say, for example, I said it in a theoretical time 1,000 years in the future as opposed to 3,000 years, because those are also still questions that I'm thinking about. The very first draft, actually, of this of the second short story that I showed some friends, they asked for a means of grounding it. Kasi nung unang draft, wala pang timestamps, wala pang dates. So when I did the second draft, I just made the addition of putting in dates so that it could ground the reading of the story and show that there was a chronology that happened from the first event listed in the story to the very last one. Definitely that's something that I can explore, and that's something that I will have to examine my idea further so that I can get a little more clarity on where I'm going. I was, well, first of all, this project, the second one here for the harvest, if you can perceive a little bit of tentativeness about how long I wanted it to be, or what it's going to be in the grand scheme of things, if it's going to be a standalone short story, or if it's going to be combined with, let's say, for example, the futuristic or parallel story of shit sack Philippines through the eyes of another politician, this time sa, I don't know, ano pa bang mga departments. I concentrated on the agriculture aspect because the time that I wrote the very, very, very first draft of the story, which was I think 2018 or 2019, do you guys remember the summer na maraming mangga? And people were, there was a really big bumper crop of mangoes, and people were stressing out about what to do with that unnatural harvest of mangoes that fell during the summer because they were rotting too fast. And so back then I thought, that's fucking interesting. Siguro gagawa ako ng kwento na, cuz like, wow. It may seem as simple as lots of mangoes dropping at the same time because it's particularly hot, but there's so many consequences to that in terms of like the agriculture, the projects, the funds that would be allotted for projects. So ayun, so it's gonna be an additional challenge if I follow Ma'am Luna's suggestion to write climate fiction, because it's not my niche. Writing within like the more science fiction mode is definitely something that I have to brush up on, because if ever I write from the speculative, maybe I write a little bit from a speculative sensibility, but I'm not very well versed in hard fantasy or hard science fiction. Definitely something that I want to brush up on, since I know that a lot of my students now are very interested in the non-realistic modes of fiction. So, all right, I will brush up on it. The second story, I was thinking about whether it's going to be something like a standalone work or I'm going to expand it. I had this initial idea of maybe making it something like a novelette or novella, and then slowly, when you get into whoever's story, right now I'm grounding the story on like the overarching narrative of this Juan Lardo Haucho, who's just the central figure. But I had this idea where I would expand the narrative and then the reality would kind of blur. Suddenly, it would come closer to a reality that we actually concretely know, and one that doesn't have like this mishmash of the slipstream mishmash of images na coconut banana that's sludgy. Suddenly, it will become a banana that we actually know. And then maybe the reader may come to realize that this is like one big hallucination. So I don't know, added burden yon. Pag-isipan ko pa siya. So, but thank you for letting me know about the concrete things that I could revise in the story aside from ayun, interrogating whether it should interrogating first the boundaries of it. I like the comments also from Ma'am Anna about whether I intend for a work like the second story to be more mimetic or more resistant. Definitely something to chew on. Appreciate the comments of Vix na since um since the vignettes are purportedly from different sources, maybe they should sound different. They sound like someone different wrote them. It just so happens that if you read it, it's my tone because it's me. Mas gusto ko siguro yung take tips ako kay Arlo kasi very distinct yung sa vignettes niya. So in terms of form, I will explore more of that. Thank you so much also to Sir Butch and to Sir Roland for giving me things to think about in terms of transformation, hope, agency, and how much I want to involve a discussion, at least an internal discussion of how much hope and resistance comes into the story of someone like a young mom or people within the story of the second story, within the world of the second story who are making decisions also and not just engaging with the story of si Haucho. And lastly, Sir Jun, nakakaiyak po yung mga comments ninyo. And I embrace it. Siyempre takot ako. Maybe just the central idea of why I'm only talking about this now several years after I left my last like engagement, my last deep engagement with the government. The reason it took me so long to talk about this, and the reason why I expected na when I drafted these stories that there would be some kind of distance is because I'm scared. Aren't we all? Like if we problematize the government, ano bang mangyayari sa atin? Yeah, if we haven't received our first death threats, or if we haven't been red tagged for the first time, if there's always a chance that if we write something like this and it's actually quite spelled out what we intend to do or the kind of questions that we want to provoke when we write things like this, ay may mangyayari, may consequences. But well, kaya ako nag-submit dito because I don't want to be that doubtful forever. Yun nga lang. There you go. Okay na ba? Thank you. Basta thank you everyone. I'm really thankful that I was able to engage you in this manner.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bibay. And I guess with that, I will turn over to Rona.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Jing, at pagbati sa iyong proyekto, Pipay. At this juncture ay ititigil natin ang ating live stream upang makapagpahinga ang mga nasa Zoom room at kayo pong nanonood sa Facebook at YouTube. Huwag kalimutang bisitahin at ibahagi ang aming social media pages. Kita-kits po tayo muli mamayang 2 p.m. Magandang umaga po sa lahat.